The awakening hall was buzzing with laughter as Lance Carver came to his senses after the ringing in his ears subsided. He was still standing on the stone podium in front of the Crystal of Destiny. The crystal glowed with a dim gray light. A translucent inscription hung above his head, visible to the entire hall. Class, Wandering Merchant, rank F, no attack skills. The administrator of Stormvale Academy was already crossing his name off the combat rosters. The quill scraped across the parchment louder than the combined laughter of 300 recruits. Lance clenched his fists and kept his gaze fixed on the inscription. An hour ago, he had stepped onto this platform full of hope. His father had died in the Vale's mines and left the family with a debt of 400 silver. The combat class meant contracts and a salary. A gray crystal meant the end. Dorian Vale stood in the front row in his brand new novice armor. An hour ago, his crystal had flashed gold. The Knight of the Dawn class. Rank A. Dorian told the administrator loudly that the academy should charge merchants an entrance fee just like they do for street vendors. The hall erupted in laughter again. Standing next to Dorian was Morel Astor. Her crystal indicated a rank B Ice Mage class. She wasn't laughing. She was looking at Lance and frowning. Administrator Holden raised his hand, and the hall fell silent. He announced that, according to the Academy's bylaws, every new recruit was required to complete an introductory practicum in the Ash Tunnels in 3 days. Anyone who failed to bring proof of participation in the cleanup from the tunnels would be expelled. Expelled students were required to pay the Academy the full enrollment fee. Lenz felt the ground give way beneath his feet. The entrance fee amounted to another 200 silver coins. He had borrowed them from the moneylender Gavarna against a promissory note. A familiar figure in a brown cloak was already looming at the hall's doorway. Gavarna's steward had come to witness the debtor's awakening. The clerk saw the gray inscription and smiled so broadly that Lenz's teeth began to ache. Lenz stepped down from the podium, and at that moment, a window appeared before his eyes that only he could see. The system reported that the traveler's shop had been activated. The shop's shelves were empty. At the bottom of the window, a single line of explanation glowed. Items appear from creatures defeated with the owner's participation. The shop's currency is coins of valor. They are awarded for contributions to victory. Current balance, 0. Lenz reread the line 3 times. The word participation was highlighted more brightly than the rest. Not killing. Participation. He closed the window and walked over to the recruitment board, where squads were recruiting newbies for the training program. Recruits with combat classes were crowding around the board. They were being snapped up like hotcakes. Lance approached 4 squads in a row. The first commander laughed in his face. The second silently pointed to the sign above the board. The sign stated that they didn't take dead weight. The third offered him a job carrying bags for half a share, then immediately withdrew the offer. The fourth was Dorian. Dorian was recruiting a personal entourage of top performers and announced to everyone that he'd take the merchant if he'd polish boots for the entire squad. Lance turned and walked out of the hall amid another burst of laughter. He didn't go to the dormitory. He went to the lower city, to the hunter's barracks. There, by the hitching post, 5 ragged men were sitting around an overturned cart. Their leader was named Garth One Ear. Lenz had known him since childhood. Garth used to buy pickaxes and ropes from his father. Garth's squad had been unable to clear the goblin lairs north of the tunnels for 3 weeks because the goblins had killed their archer and learned to avoid their traps. Guild rates were falling. Garth sat as gloomy as a storm cloud. Lance approached and said he knew how to lure the goblins into a trap without an archer. Garth raised his single eyebrow and asked who this kid thought he was. Lance replied that he was the son of Carver, the mine foreman, and that the goblins of the Ash Burrows lived by the same laws as the rats in the mines. His father exterminated the rats every spring. What was needed wasn't a trap on the trail. What's needed is bait that smells stronger than fear. Garth looked at him for a long time. Then he said that Carver's son could give it a try. but the merchant's cut would be 1/10 and not a coin more. Lance agreed without haggling, and Garth was surprised a second time. All evening, Lance prepared by assembling a short, vicious clock. He traded a bucket of tripe to the tanner for repairing the scales. In the backyard of the barracks, he cooked up a stinking mixture of tripe and marsh fat using his father's recipe for rats. He took apart Garth's broken wagon and fashioned 3 shields with struts from the side panels. At first, the hunters laughed at the kid in the apron. By midnight, they were silently handing him nails. Foreman Gavarna found him there too. He stood over the pit with the trap and said that in 4 days, Lance's IOU would be sold to the Wales House if the debt wasn't paid off. The House of Wales bought up the debts of miners' families and turned the debtors into lifelong laborers in their mines. Lenz froze for a second over the pit. Then he continued driving in the stakes. The foreman shrugged and walked away. Garth asked why an academician with a debt would crawl into burrows for a tithe. Lance replied that he didn't need money. He needed defeated goblins. Garth tapped his temple with a finger. Before dawn, a party of 6 set out for the northern burrows. 5 of them carried weapons. The 6th carried a bucket of stink and 3 wooden shields. Above the entrance to the burrow, Lance saw a shop window flash in the corner of his eye. Empty shelves awaited. He took a deep breath and poured the bait into the trench he dug himself leading to the pit. The first shriek came from the darkness of the burrow, then a second. Then the ground beneath his feet began to rumble with the sound of dozens of bare feet. Garth cursed and said the kid had stirred up the whole nest at once. Lance stood behind a shield and replied that that was exactly the plan. Lenz Carver had been assigned the lowest rank, an F-class traveling merchant with a stall where goods appeared from creatures he had helped defeat in exchange for coins of valor. In 3 days, he had to complete a practical exam in the ash tunnels. Otherwise, he'd be expelled and left with a debt of 600 silver coins, which the steward, Gvarna, threatened to sell to the Vale family in 4 days. Lance hired himself out for a tithe to the hunter Hart and, using bait, lured an entire goblin nest into a prepared trap. The important figures present were Dorian Vale, an Oirank knight, and the ice mage Morel Aster, who wasn't laughing. The goblins poured out of the burrow in a solid gray stream. Lance counted 2 tens and lost count. The first ones fell into the chute with the bait and rolled down into the pit onto the stakes. The ones behind slowed down, and the trap stopped working exactly as he'd planned. The goblins were cowardly but not stupid. Then Lenz shouted to Garth that it was time to move the walls. The hunters grabbed 3 shields from the cart and advanced in a wedge formation, pinning the goblins against the cliff by the stream. Lenz had assembled the shields with struts specifically for this purpose. The goblins lunged at the wood and got stuck. The hunters' spears struck the gaps between the shields with the steady rhythm of hammers in a blacksmith's forge. Lance stood in the center of the wedge, unarmed. He held the strut of the central shield and step by step pressed forward along with everyone else. His shoulders were on fire. His palms were rubbed raw and bleeding. He didn't unclench his hands. An hour later, at the cliff's edge, it was all over. 26 bodies. Not a single serious wound among the hunters. Garth sat down on the ground and began to laugh, simply out of relief. He said that in 3 weeks, the squad hadn't killed even a dozen of these creatures, but here, in a single morning, an entire nest had been wiped out. And then, before Lenz's eyes, the shelf lit up. The shelves were no longer empty. The system reported that 39 coins of valor had been awarded for his decisive contribution to the victory. 3 items with tags appeared on the first shelf. Cave Goblin's Grip for 12 coins. Nest Runner's Stamina for 15 coins. Burrow Scout's Instinct for 19 coins. Lenz stood among the dead goblins and read the labels like a hungry man reads a menu. He chose the grip and the stamina. The shop deducted 27 coins. The world swayed for a second. A burning sensation, like boiling water, shot up his arms from his palms to his shoulders. Then the burning subsided. and Lance picked up a shard of a goblin spear from the ground. The shaft crunched in his fingers like a dry twig. He opened his hand and looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. Garth noticed the crunch and stopped laughing. He asked what had just happened. Lance replied that his class allowed him to buy the power of defeated creatures. The hunters exchanged glances. The young spearman Byrne said the merchant was exaggerating and challenged him to an arm wrestling match for a mug of ale. 10 seconds later, Byrne was sitting on the ground, shaking his sore wrist. Garth looked at Lance without any trace of mockery. He said it was the first time he'd heard of such a class. Then he added that a tithe was unfair and raised Lance's share to a quarter. Lance didn't refuse. A quarter of the guild's reward for the lair amounted to 30 silver pieces. It was nowhere near enough to pay off his debt, but it was the first money his class had earned him in a day. On the way back, Lance wasn't thinking about the silver. He was thinking about the tags. The goblins had provided goblin-level goods, so wolves would yield wolf-level items, trolls would yield troll-level items. That meant his body was a warehouse that could be filled with others' power, as long as he had enough coins and defeated creatures. That meant the Academy's worst class, with the right turnover, could become the best. They were waiting for them in the barracks, not the quartermaster. Worse. A corporal from the Academy Guard was standing by the horse hitch with an order. Someone had reported that the recruit, Carver, had participated in commercial hunting before the introductory practicum. The regulations prohibited recruits from taking on hired work before enrollment. The penalty was 50 silver coins or disciplinary confinement until the practicum itself. Detention meant automatic failure and expulsion. Garth flushed and started saying something about his people, but Lance touched his shoulder. He handed the corporal 30 of his silver coins and asked for a 20-day extension until the end of the week. The corporal took the money and said the extension would cost an additional 5 on top of that. Lance nodded without batting an eye. When the guard left, Garth asked why the guy had handed over every last coin. Lance replied that an arrest would cost more. Someone from the academy had clearly ratted him out. Someone who was bothered even by a beggar merchant. He didn't name a name, but both of them thought of the same person. That evening, Lance was poring over a map of the ash tunnels that he'd begged from Garth. The training exercise took place in the upper galleries. The recruits were divided into squads and sent to clear out the marked tunnels. But Hart tapped his finger on the lower tier of the map and said that things had become unsettled in the tunnels over the past month. The night wolves had come down from the ridge and taken over the old mine workings. The guild had submitted a report to the academy, but the academy replied that the upper galleries were safe and would not cancel the field training. Garth said that wolves were patient creatures. They don't howl. They wait in the darkness and kill those who fall behind. Len stared at the map and felt a fierce, cold thrill flaring up beneath his ribs. All the new recruits would go into the tunnels, fearing the wolves. He'd go into the tunnels to shop. That morning, he'd spent his last copper coins on lamp oil and a skein of red cord. Muriel Astor caught up with him at the academy gates. She said she'd heard about the denunciation and that Dorian had been bragging in the dining hall yesterday about how he'd put the merchant in his place. She also said that her squad was now without A, and that the administrator would forcibly reassign the remaining recruits. Lance asked why she was telling him this. Muriel looked at his palms, smeared with blood, and replied that she had seen the Awakening Hall. Everyone was laughing at the gray crystal, and the merchant was the only one out of 300 who stood with his head held high. She needed a fifth who wouldn't run away. Lance remained silent for 3 heartbeats. Then he said he had a condition. Whatever the squad won in the tunnels had to be officially recorded as a joint victory of the squad, with his participation. Muriel was surprised by such a strange condition, but agreed. She didn't yet know that she had just signed the best deal of her life. For his decisive contribution to the destruction of the nest, Lance received 39 coins of valor and bought a goblin's grip and a runner's stamina, while Garth went from being a skeptic to an ally and increased his share. A tip-off cost Lance all the money he'd earned as a fine, and he suspects Dorian. In the lower levels of the tunnels, night wolves have taken up residence, a fact the Academy keeps quiet about. Lance joined Morel's squad as the fifth member, on the condition that all the squad's victories be credited to him. He still owes 600 silver coins, plus a 25-coin penalty for the delay. The tunnels greeted the training group with the smell of cold ash. 40 squads were deployed across the upper galleries. Morel's squad was assigned Tunnel 7. Besides Lance and Morel, the squad included the archer Tobin and the twin shield-bearers Orm and Oswald. All the way there, Tobin counted aloud how many rat tails they needed to turn in for credit and whined that, with a merchant in the squad, they'd lose points for having a non-combatant. Lenz remained silent, hammering a nail with a red cord into the wall every 30 paces. Tobin asked why this dead weight was ruining the government-owned walls. Lenz replied that smoke in the tunnels crept along the ceiling, and in a panic, people lost their bearings. The cord led to the exit even in the dark. Tobin snorted that only one person was causing panic here. An hour later, the squad had cleared the first chamber of ash rats. Morel froze the exits shut with ice. The twins crushed the creatures with their shields. Lance used a hook from his supplies to haul the carcasses into a pile. The shop jingled and credited 6 coins. The rats' loot was junk, but Lenz noted the important part. The system honestly counted his hook and his plan as contributions. By noon, what Garth had warned about happened. A scent wafted from a side tunnel, not ash, but a beast. Lenz raised his hand and the squad stopped. Tobin said he couldn't hear anything. Lance didn't hear anything either. He saw it. 4 pairs of green lights hung near the floor in the darkness of the tunnel. The night wolves weren't howling. They were waiting. Morel hurled an icy spear, and the darkness exploded. There weren't 4 wolves, there were 9. The pack scattered across the chamber, dousing the lamps with their tails and flanking them. Orm yelled that he couldn't see a thing. Their formation fell apart in 10 seconds. And then Lenz did what he'd been preparing to do since that morning. He shouted for everyone to line up against the red cord with their backs to the wall and smashed a jar of swamp fat on the floor. The sharp stench overwhelmed the wolves' sense of smell. The pack was momentarily disoriented. Guided by Lance's voice, Morel struck with ice wherever he pointed. He aimed flawlessly because, in the light of the single lamp, he saw what the others couldn't: shadows. Lance gave orders while silently counting coins in his head. When the 5th wolf went under the ice, the shopkeeper offered him the merchandise he'd been dreaming of since last night. The night hunter's vision for 40 coins. He had 38 to his credit. He was too short. Lenz took the 6th wolf himself. He dove beneath the beast as it leaped and drove the hook up into its throat from below, just as his father had taught him to remove a runaway minecar from the cable. The wolf thrashed and went still. The shop credited him 9 coins for the personal kill. Lance bought the vision without moving from his spot. The pain splashed into his eyes like boiling water and then subsided. The darkness of the tunnels dissolved. He could see every crack, every hair on the necks of the 3 remaining wolves. He saw their fear. What followed wasn't a fight, but a slaughter. Lance called out their positions before the wolves could even leap. 5 minutes later, it was all over. The squad stood among the 9 carcasses, breathing heavily. Tobin stared at Lance with his mouth agape. He asked how the merchant could see in the dark. Lenz replied that he'd bought his eyes from their own leader. Tobin sat down on a carcass and said he was taking back what he had said about dead weight. All 9 wolves, according to the paperwork, were credited as a joint victory with Lenz's participation, and the shop handed him another 50 coins for his decisive contribution. On the way back, the squad stumbled upon a foreign red trail. Blood. Lots of it. The tracks led from Tunnel 9. Tunnel 9 had been assigned to Dorian's squad. Morel turned pale and said there were 6 freshmen in there. Lance had already seen what the darkness was hiding further down the tunnel. Shattered lamps, an abandoned shield, and the trail of a body being dragged. There wasn't just one pack. Down in the old mine shaft, a second one was lurking, and it had already tasted blood. Headquarters demanded they return and report. The report would take an hour to reach the top. Lenz said that in an hour there would be no one left to report on. He unwound the rest of the red cord and led the way along the trail of blood. In the old mine shaft, at the bottom of a dried-up spillway, 4 were huddled together. Dorian stood over a wounded twin from his retinue, a sword clutched in his trembling hands. His golden armor was slashed open on one side. 11 wolves, led by a gray she-wolf the size of a calf, were circling the spillway. Dorian saw the squad descending the wall, and his expression fell. He shouted that the merchant had come to watch real fighters die. Lance didn't answer. He was in command. Morel froze the crest of the spillway, cutting off the she-wolf's route from above. The twins stood with their shields blocking the only passageway. Tobin struck at the eyes that Lance had pointed out to him. Lance himself leaped down to Dorian and stood over the wounded man with his hook. The gray she-wolf went for him because beasts always go for the weakest. She had made the wrong choice. With goblin-like dexterity, Lance caught her leap with his hook in her chest and, with the endurance of a runner, held her aloft for the 2 seconds Myril needed to drive her icy spear point blank. The she-wolf collapsed. The pack, now leaderless, faltered and fell beneath the shields and arrows. It grew quiet. Dorian sat on the rocks, looking up at Lance. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Above, the boots of the academic guard, led by the steward Holden, were already clattering as they arrived. Holden descended into the spillway. He looked at the 11 corpses, at the living freshman, at the merchant with the blood-stained hook, and the face of the old steward, which had been expressionless for 20 years, slowly contorted. He asked who had commanded the fight. Dorian opened his mouth and told the truth. Carver had been in command. A stall in Lenz's peripheral vision clinked softly. 112 coins of valor were credited. New merchandise. Regeneration for the gray-haired she-wolf. 60 coins. Lenz bought it before Holden had finished the report. The cuts on his palms healed right before the guard's eyes. One of the guards cursed and cast a protective spell. Holden closed the report and said that both squads had passed the practical with honors. Then he added quietly, so that only Lance could hear. The rector was expecting him that evening. And the House of Vales had already sent a letter to the Academy bearing his name. During the practical exercise, Lance had acquired the Night Hunter's vision and the Gray She-Wolf's regeneration, and his standing had risen thanks to his decisive contribution to 2 victories. Lance's squad saved Dorian's squad from the second pack, and Dorian publicly acknowledged that Carver had been in command. Even the skeptics, Tobin and Holden, changed their tune. The practicum was passed with honors. Ahead lay a summons to the rector and a letter at the Vale household, addressed to Lance. The debt of 625 silver coins still hung over him. The rector's office smelled of wax and old steel. Lance entered and immediately realized that the conversation would not be about the course credit. By the window, with his back to the door, stood a man in a gray traveling cloak over an expensive doublet. Rector Malvery sat at his desk and looked like the owner of a house that had just been raided by bailiffs. The man by the window turned around. Lance recognized him from the portraits on the IOS. Lord Cedric Vale, Dorian's father and the owner of half the province's mines. Lord Vale spoke softly. He said he'd heard a great deal about the young man's talent. That the Vale household had bought his promissory note from the moneylender Gvarna that very morning. That the household was prepared to forgive the debt of 625 silver coins in full. In exchange, the young man would sign a lifetime contract as the Vale household's personal supplier. His shop would serve only the household. His abilities would be evaluated by the household's experts. The salary is decent. Freedom of movement is subject to agreement. Lenz listened and looked at the rector. The rector stared at the table. The academy was funded by donations from the houses, and everyone in the room knew it. Lenz asked what would happen if he refused. Lord Vale spread his hands almost sadly. Then the debt will be subject to immediate collection. The Carver family's property will be seized. Lens's mother and sisters will work off the debt in the house's mines at the standard rate. Lens knew the standard rate. At that rate, his father would have to pay off this debt for 11 years. Lance clenched his fists behind his back and then unclenched them. Then he said he was requesting 3 days to make a decision based on the debtor's rights outlined in the Usurers Guild Charter. Lord Vale smiled and said that the law was the law. 3 days. He left without saying goodbye to the rector. Malvery looked up and said quietly that the academy could not protect a student from a debt court. But for 3 days, the student was free to do as he pleased. Lance bowed and left. Morell was waiting for him in the hallway with Tobin and the twins. And Garth, whom the guards didn't want to let past the gate, but who somehow managed to get through on his own. Lance told them everything as it was. Tobin whistled and said that even a gold prospector couldn't scrape together 600 silver coins in 3 days. Lance replied that he had no intention of earning the silver through hunting. He planned to start a business. Everyone looked at him as if he were out of his mind. Then Lance opened the shop and, for the umpteenth time, reread the line that had appeared after the battle with the she-wolf. The system reported that upon reaching 100 coins of valor, the counterfunction had been unlocked. The owner can create copies of purchased items and sell them to others. The price of a copy is set by the owner. Creating a copy costs the owner 1/3 of the item's original price in coins of valor. A copy is 1/4 weaker than the original, and each person can obtain only 1 copy of each item. Lance explained this aloud in simple terms. He could sell Tobin Wolf's Vision or Orm Goblin's Grip. To any of Garth's hunters, a runner's stamina, not permanently weakening himself, but through a copy. Just as a scribe transcribes a book without losing his own. It grew very quiet. Garth sat down on a bench and said that if this were true, then the boy was now worth more than all of Vale's mines combined. They checked it out right away in the backyard. Lance made a copy of the Goblin's Grip for 4 coins and sold it to Tobin for a token copper. Tobin picked up a training bar and bent it. Then he sat down next to the bar and was silent for a minute. Then he asked how much Lance would sell him his sight for. What followed was a whirlwind of 2 crazy days. Garth brought 8 proven hunters to the barracks' backyard, and each left with a copy of the endurance ability for 15 silver coins apiece. The rumor spread through the lower city faster than wildfire. By the evening of the first day, there was a line of 20 people outside the barracks. Lens didn't sell to just anyone. He kept a ledger and recorded every buyer with Garth's guarantee. Only those for whom someone vouched received copies of strength. By the evening of the second day, the line had grown to 50 people, and guild foremen could be seen among them. The master mason bought a grip for 4 of his crew, and his crew completed in a single day the masonry work that had previously taken a week. The night watch foreman bought 3 copies of Wolf's Eye, and his shift caught thieves red-handed in the dark docks for the first time in a month. Skeptics came and went one after another, and each new skeptic held a higher rank. By the end of the third day, there were 940 silver coins in Lens's tin box, and only 11 coins of valor remained on the ledger because the copies were devouring them mercilessly. Lens made a separate note of this in his ledger. Trade without hunting will kill the business. Hunting without trade will kill the purse. Only together. On the morning of the debt court hearing, Lens laid out exactly 625 silver coins before the bailiff. The bailiff counted it twice and looked at the representative of the House of Vales. The representative silently rolled up the contract, which had never been put to use. Lance took the paid-in-full receipt and went out to the square where 11 men were waiting for him. Morell's squad. Garth's hunters. He raised the receipt above his head and tore it in half. Someone laughed, someone clapped, and Lance looked over their heads at the town hall window. There, behind the glass, stood Lord Cedric Vale, and he was no longer smiling. That evening in the barracks, Garth placed a blank guild charter on the table. He said that the hunting branch of his license allowed him to establish a new guild with 10 signatories. There were exactly 11 of them in that courtyard. Lance picked up a quill. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Standing in the doorway was a man in black bearing the silver seal of the Continental Chamber of Commerce. He said that the chamber had received 3 complaints regarding the illegal trade of unlicensed goods of an unidentified nature. Trade was suspended pending an investigation, and samples of the goods are subject to seizure for examination. The man smiled and added that the chamber intends to examine the samples along with their source. The counter has been unlocked, and Lance may sell copies of purchased abilities 1/4 weaker than the originals, at a rate of 1 per person, spending 1/3 of the item's price in coins of valor. In 3 days of trading copies, he earned 940 silver coins, paid off his debt, and broke Lord Cedric Vale's exploitative contract, but nearly depleted his coin balance. 11 allies are preparing to establish a guild under Garth's license. The Continental Chamber of Commerce, acting on 3 complaints, has suspended trade and intends to seize the samples along with Lance himself. Lenz set down his pen and went out to meet the man in black, before Garth had even had a chance to stand up. He asked on what grounds the chamber was seizing the source of the goods if that source was a citizen with recognized academic standing. The man in black introduced himself as Auditor Craze and produced a second document. The grounds cited were a provision regarding goods of an unidentified nature that threatened guild order. Under this provision, the chamber had once seized alchemists along with their cauldrons. Lenz read the document and felt the stares of 11 people on the back of his neck. One wrong move and they would all become accomplices. Then he took a step no one expected. He invited the auditor inside and offered him a deal. The chamber wants to determine the nature of the goods. Lenz is ready to determine it publicly, tomorrow in the lower city arena. Guild elders and the chamber itself will provide any inspectors they wish. If the product turns out to be a hoax or poison, Lance will turn himself into the chamber. If the product proves to be what it claims to be, the chamber will not seize the source, but will license it, just as it licenses any master with a unique craft. Christ looked at the young man for a long time. Then he said that in his 20 years of service, debtors usually ran out the window to escape him, rather than summoning him to the arena. He accepted the terms and scheduled the trials for noon. The night was spent making preparations. Miro wrote invitations to the workshops as Lenz dictated. Tobin and the twins hauled targets and sledgehammers to the arena. Garth went around to the foreman who had already purchased copies, and by morning, 12 workshops had promised to send people. Lenz spent 8 of his 11 coins of valor on the last 2 copies and went to sleep for 3 hours for the first time in a week. By noon, the lower city arena couldn't hold everyone who wanted to attend. Seated on the platform were Auditor Kreis, the chamber's scribe, and a mage investigator invited by the chamber, who carried an artifact for discerning illusions. In the front row, Lenz spotted Lord Vale's gray cloak and wasn't surprised. Complaints to the chamber don't just appear out of thin air. The trials lasted 3 hours. A porter with a copy of the Goblin Grip lifted a barrel that 2 men had previously been unable to pry off the ground. The interrogator's artifact remained silent. There was no Maroka. A guard with wolf-like eyes from the far end of the arena read aloud a letter that the clerk was holding in the shadow of the awning. The artifact remained silent. Garda's huntress, possessing the endurance trait, ran 40 laps and breathed more evenly than the judges. The crowd roared. The chamber's clerk broke 2 quills while taking notes. And then Lord Vale stood up and asked to speak. He said that the tricks with the barrels were charming, but the chamber should ask the young man about the most important thing, where the goods come from. The young man buys power from defeated monsters. Today it's goblins and wolves, but tomorrow he'll help defeat a human and put human strength up for sale. Is the chamber prepared to license the trade in human beings? The arena buzzed. Lance stepped onto the platform and waited for silence. He said that the Lord had asked the right question and deserved an honest answer. The shop had never once offered him human merchandise, even though people were being defeated right beside him. He opened the interface to the investigator as much as he could show, and the mage confirmed that the list of goods contained only creatures from the monster registry. Then Lance turned to the arena and said what mattered most. His craft does not turn people into commodities. His craft empowers ordinary people to withstand what once killed them. A porter unloads 3 cartloads a day instead of 1 and feeds his family. A guard spots a knife in the dark before the knife spots him. A hunter returns alive from the tunnels.
If the Council considers this a threat to Guild order, let it say so aloud to those who now stand in this arena. The arena was silent for 3 heartbeats. Then it erupted. Christ waited for the silence to pass and stood up. He announced the Council's decision. The nature of the goods has been established and recognized as authentic.
The craft is recognized as unique and is subject to licensing at the highest guild rank. The license is issued not to the master personally, but to the guild of which the master is a member, in accordance with the Continental Code. Craze paused and asked whether Master Carver was a member of the guild. Garth was already ascending the platform with a blank patent and a quill. 11 signatures were affixed to the paper before 5,000 witnesses. With the 12th signature, Craze, on behalf of the chamber, certified the guild's establishment. Thus was born the Coin Exchange Guild. A porter in the crowd had shouted out the name as a joke, suggesting that the merchant exchanged monsters for people, and Lance ordered that it be written down exactly as it was. By evening, a line of people wishing to join stretched a whole city block long at the barracks gate. Lance sat poring over the guild's ledger, entering the rules he'd been mulling over all these days. Copies only for guild members and licensed workshops. Every sale must be recorded in the book. A third of the proceeds goes into the common fund for hunting raids, because without defeated monsters, the counter is empty. Hart read over his shoulder and shook his head, repeating that the boy wasn't building a shop, but an army with an accounting department. Late at night, when the barracks were asleep, Morel came to see Lance. She placed a letter on the table bearing a seal Lance didn't recognize, a 2-headed griffin above a set of scales. Morel said she recognized the seal from her father's papers. It was from the Royal Treasury Office. Lenz opened the letter. The Crown Treasury notified him that the activities of the Coin Exchange Guild had been classified as a matter of national importance. A Crown auditor would arrive in the city in 10 days to assess the strategic significance of the craft. Until his arrival, the guild was ordered not to enter into contracts with foreign subjects or great houses. Below was a handwritten note in small, neat handwriting. An anonymous well-wisher wrote that the Crown auditor was not traveling alone. Accompanying him was a recruiter from the Ministry of War. And the Ministry of War does not license unique crafts. It requisitions them. Lenz finished reading, turned the page over, and looked at the signature. There was no signature. Instead, at the bottom of the page, a small, gray-haired she-wolf was drawn. Lenz turned the confiscation into a public trial, won it before the eyes of 5,000 witnesses, repelled Lord Vale's attack by proving that the shop did not sell human goods, and received a top-tier license from Auditor Kreis. The Exchange Coin Guild was established with 11 founders and Lenz's rules. 1/3 of the proceeds for raids, copies only for members and workshops. Everything recorded in the ledger. The Royal Treasury declared the guild a matter of national importance. The auditor would arrive in 10 days, and an anonymous benefactor with the drawing of a gray-haired she-wolf warned that a recruiter from the War Ministry, which requisitions unique crafts, is traveling with the auditor. With 10 days until the auditor's arrival, Lenz mapped out his schedule hour by hour, just as his father used to schedule shifts in the mine. The guild needed 3 things: coins of valor, high-quality goods, and a reputation that even the ministry couldn't requisition. All 3 things were in one place, in the lower levels of the ash tunnels, where not even Garth's guild dared to venture. His father's old maps showed flooded tunnels beneath the wolf's workings. Garth said no one had gone there since people stopped returning from those depths. 20 years ago, 3 work crews had disappeared there at once, and the tunnels were sealed off. The miners spoke of the Lord of the Depths, a creature no one had ever seen alive. Lenz looked at the map and saw not a creature. He saw merchandise that no one else on the continent possessed. They cobbled together the first raid in 2 days. Lenz sold 8 more copies to the workshops, and with the coins of valor he earned, bought himself a black bat from the workshop's inventory. Morel begged the Academy for a training artifact, an air bubble, taking personal responsibility for it. Garth selected the 6 best men, and each received a copy of Wolf's Vision from the communal pot. Tobin whined that the merchant was leading them to their dooms and checked his bowstring every half hour. They descended through the old spillway, the very one where the gray she-wolf had lain. Lenz led the way. His newly honed hearing picked up things in the darkness that even a wolf's eyes couldn't see. Drips. The creak of sediment. And a steady, heavy sound from the depths, like the breath of a blacksmith's bellows. On the 3rd level, they began to make discoveries. Bones, neither goblin nor wolf. The bones had been melted like candle wax. Morel crouched over a skull and said that ice wouldn't help here because the bone had been melted with acid. Tobin asked in a trembling voice what kind of creature spat acid. Lenz replied that they'd find out soon, and buy it. Tobin said he hated it when a merchant talked that way. The flooded gallery opened up through a breach. Black water stood like a mirror all the way up to the vaulted ceiling. Morel's air bubble kept the 6 of them afloat. They waded chest-deep through the water along the flooded railroad track. Lenz's hearing guided them between the supports, and in the middle of the tunnel, the breath of the bellows fell silent. Lenz managed to shout a single word. Pillars. The squad dashed toward the supports a split second before the water exploded. The Lord of the Depths turned out to be a blind, armored lizard as long as 2 minecars. For 20 years it had devoured everything that descended, growing to a size not recorded in any registry. The acid from its maw burned through stone. The battle lasted 40 minutes and 3 times nearly ended in the death of everyone. Tobin's arrows bounced off the armor. Morel's ice melted from the acid spittle. What saved them was that Lenz heard the creature before it struck and positioned his squad behind the supports like pieces on a board. And then he heard the crucial thing. The breath of the beasts faltered when the lizard raised its belly above the flooded rail. Its armor didn't cover its belly. Lenz ordered Morel to freeze not the creature, but the water beneath it. A crust of ice formed. The lizard ripped it open with its belly, and Garth, along with 2 hunters, drove 3 spears to their full length into the white crack. The creature roared so loudly that stones rained down from the vaulted ceiling. Then it fell silent. The squad stood chest deep in a black water, and no one could believe they were still alive. The counter clanged louder than it ever had before. 400 coins of valor were awarded for a decisive contribution to the victory over the named creature. The Lord of the Depths wares were placed on the top shelf. Armored hide for 180 coins. Acidic blood for 210. And the 3rd item, which made Lance's throat go dry. Sense of the Depths for 150. The description stated that the owner could sense all living things in the darkness within 50 paces. Without eyes, without ears, and without light. Lance bought the armored hide and the sense of the depths right there in the water. The hide clamped him in a searing grip for a full minute, and Garth held him by the shoulders until he screamed himself hoarse. But on the way back, Lenz led the way without a lamp and guided the squad through a cave-in that wasn't even marked on his father's map. Above, the city was waiting for them, and it already knew everything. One of the hunters had let slip to his wife about the Lord of the Depths even before they descended, and a crowd had been gathered at the mine entrance for 3 hours. When the 6 of them emerged from the gate, dragging the severed head of the lizard, the crowd first fell silent and then roared so loudly that windows opened in the upper city. Lenz looked at the faces. There, the foreman of the mining shop, who for 20 years had been signing papers to close the lower levels, was turning pale. There was the widow from the defunct cooperative, wiping her eyes. There was the clerk from the Chamber of Commerce pushing his way forward and asking Master Carver to confirm the killing for the registry, because the crown paid a bounty for those named creatures. The bounty for the Lord of the Depths had been accumulating for 20 years and amounted to 1,200 silver pieces. Garth heard the figure and sat down right on the pavement. That evening, in the guild hall, which they had rented that very day using the bounty money, Lenz gathered the founders and laid out his plan. There were 7 days until the inspector arrived. In those 7 days, the guild would open the lower levels for mining, officially take on a contract from the city to clear the area, and stake everything on the main objective. By the time the inspector arrived, the exchange coin would no longer be an eccentric's shop but an institution without which the entire province's ore production would grind to a halt. Requisitioning a trade that feeds the province is 3 times harder than requisitioning a single boy's trade. Hard asked how the boy knew how the ministries thought. Lenz placed a letter featuring a gray-haired she-wolf on the table and replied that the boy didn't know. But someone who did know very much wanted him to have time to prepare. And that someone had been at the spillway on the day of the workshop, because the drawing of the she-wolf was done from life. Morel took the letter, held it up to the candle, and suddenly froze. A watermark appeared in the light beneath the drawing. A 2-headed griffin above a set of scales, the same one on the treasury seal. The well-wisher had written on paper from the royal chancellery. The raid on the flooded levels had brought victory over the so-called Lord of the Depths, 400 coins of valor, a crown bonus of 1,200 silver coins, and Lenz had purchased armored hide and the sense of the depths, the ability to perceive all living things within 50 paces in the darkness. The guild has rented a house and is preparing within 7 days a city contract to clear the lower levels in order to become indispensable to the province before the inspector's arrival. The well-wisher, with a drawing of a gray-haired she-wolf, writes on paper from the royal chancellery bearing the treasury's watermark, which means the guild has a secret ally in the capital. The city contract wasn't awarded just like that. In the morning, Lenz submitted an application to City Hall to clear the lower levels, and by noon it became clear that there were 2 applications. The second was submitted by the Vale's house. Lord Cedric offered the city the same service, but using a mercenary company from the capital and at a third of the price. Mayor Tolm, a man with the face of someone to whom everyone is indebted and who is indebted to everyone, scheduled a public hearing for 2 days later. Garth grumbled that Vale was undercutting his own profits just to strangle the guild in its cradle. Lance remained silent and did the math. Vale wasn't a fool and didn't operate at a loss. That meant the company from the capital would recoup the difference through some other means. Lance sent Tobin and 2 hunters to meet the company on the highway and keep a close watch on everything. Tobin returned by nightfall and reported something strange. The company was traveling with 4 covered wagons under guard more heavily armed than a shipment of gold. During a rest stop, people in gray robes with their eyes blindfolded were led out of one of the wagons. 8 people. They were being fed by hand. Muriel was the first to turn pale. She said she'd read her father's papers about the trials in the capital. The gray robes are worn by convicted criminals handed over by the crown to private hands under a redemption program. Cheap labor that they don't mind sending down into the acid mines. That's where the 1/3 discount came from. Vale was planning to clear the levels using other people's death row inmates. At the hearings, City Hall was packed to the rafters. Lord Vale spoke first, and he spoke eloquently. He presented the figures and the capital company's guarantee terms. Then he gave the floor to Lenz, and Lenz delivered what he'd been preparing for 2 days. He didn't mention the shenanigans, because the company's paperwork was technically in order, and Vale would have smeared him across the wall for slander. Instead, he challenged the city to a test. Let both sides clear an identical emergency tunnel tomorrow. The city will accept the work from whichever side does it better. Mayor Tolm perked up because the spectacle was free and the decision was being taken off his hands. Vale shrugged and agreed. His company consisted of 40 veterans against 11 guild members. The next day, the entire lower city gathered at the Adits. Vale's company entered the eastern Adit in formation to the beat of a drum.
The guild entered the western Adit in silence.
And for the next 2 hours, the city watched a difference that couldn't be bought for a third of the price. The company worked like a company. Shields, torches, casualties. Twice, the wounded were carried out of the eastern tunnel, victims of acid slugs that had multiplied on the lizard's remains. The guild worked as a single organism with eyes in the dark. Lenz's deep-sensing instinct located the slug's nests through the rock. Copies of Wolf Vision guided the torchless hunters, who drove the slugs into a frenzy. Lenz's armored skin withstood the acid, and he cleared out nests from corners where even the veterans wouldn't venture. By noon, the western tunnel had been cleared down to the last crevice, and the guild emerged without a single scratch, dragging 42 trophies behind them. By that time, the company had cleared 2/3 of the eastern tunnel and lost 6 men to injury. Burgomaster Tom looked at the tally board, and his face grew grim before the eyes of the entire square. He announced the next round at the exchange coin, without waiting for the end of the day. The crowd roared. But Lenz wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the commander of the capital's company, a gray-haired veteran with a scar across his eyebrow, who stood at the entrance to his uncleaned tunnel and gazed at the guild's trophies with the look of a man who had witnessed the impossible. That evening, the veteran came to the guild hall alone, without his armor. His name was Captain Drost. He placed his company dog tag on the table and said that for 30 years he had been leading men underground and burying them there. Today he had seen 11 young recruits do the work of 40 veterans without spilling a single drop of blood. He asked if the guild sold its goods to outsiders. Lance replied that the guild sold goods to guild members. Drost paused and asked how to join. Behind him in the doorway stood 9 more of his veterans, badges in hand. Vale's company began scattering back to their employer without returning. Lance accepted the tokens and realized that each one was a knife in Lord Vale's back, and that Vale would not forgive this. He was right. A day later, the trouble erupted. That night, the tanner's workshop belonging to the foreman, who had been the first to buy the replicas, caught fire. In the morning, the moneylender Gvarn refused to grant loans to 3 workshops that traded with the guild. In the afternoon, Tobin was expelled from the academy for absences he hadn't actually taken. And in the evening, the most despicable thing happened. The guards arrested Garth. The charge was that 20 years ago, his signature had appeared on the documents sealing off the lower levels, and therefore he had known about the Lord of the Depths and concealed the threat to the city. The charge was flimsy, but in Vale's hands, it held firm. The trial was set for 3 days later. The day before the inspector's arrival, Lance pored over the guild ledger until dawn. Vale wasn't targeting him directly. Vale was targeting the people around him, so that by the time the inspector arrived, the guild would be brought to its knees by scandals, and the boy could be taken with bare hands. Responding to fire with fire would mean giving Vale the excuse he was looking for. Lance closed the ledger and told Morell that it was time to use the only weapon Vale didn't have, the truth and 5,000 witnesses. The guild announced that on the day of Garth's trial, it would hold a second public event in the arena, a free distribution of 30 copies of Endurance to minors from families affected by the closure of the levels, and a detailed report on where every coin from the guild's treasury was going. The city, already ablaze with rumors of arson and arrests, was given a place to go and a question to ask aloud. Who is the guild, which feeds the lower city, standing in the way of? On the night before the trial, there were 3 knocks on the window of the guild house. A bundle lay on the windowsill.
Inside were copies of documents from the capital. An order to hand over the 8 convicted men to the Vale household. A receipt from the moneylender Gvarna for the retroactive sale of debts to the Vales. And a report from the Vale informant at the academy regarding the student Carver written on the day of the awakening. On top lay a sheet of paper with a gray she-wolf and a single line. The judge has already been paid. Pay the city. The guild had won an open competition against the Vale Company for the city contract, and Captain Drost, along with 9 veterans, had defected to Lens. Vale responded with a series of blows. The arson of the workshop, pressure on Gavarna, the expulsion of Tobin, and the arrest of Garth on trumped-up charges, with a trial held the day before the auditor's visit. Lenz was ready to hold a public event in the arena on the day of the trial, with free copies distributed to miners' families and a public report on the Treasury. A well-wisher passed on incriminating evidence against Vale, including documents on the convicted, and warned that the judge had been bribed. The morning of the trial smelled of a storm, even though the sky was clear.
The magistrate's courtroom could hold 100 people, and all 100 seats were taken by Vale's supporters even before dawn. The rest of the town stood in the square in front of City Hall, and the square was a sea of heads. Lenz had calculated correctly. The arena, where copies of the documents were being distributed, opened at dawn, and by the time the trial began, 30 miners' widows and orphans had already received their share, and the guild treasurer had read the report to the crowd down to the last copper coin. The crowd had come from the arena to City Hall, no longer as spectators. Judge Morven read the indictment in the monotonous voice of a man of paid-for performance. Garth stood in chains, looking over the heads of the crowd. The town hall archivist testified for the prosecution, presenting documents from 20 years ago, Garth's signature on the act closing the mining levels. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. Then it was the defense's turn, and Lance asked the court for one thing: to read aloud not only the Closure Act, but also its appendix, which, according to regulations, was kept in the same file. Judge Morven hesitated, and Lance repeated his request louder, so it could be heard through the open windows overlooking the square. Morwen had been bribed, but he wasn't a fool. He ordered the appendix to be brought in. The archivist returned, looking grim. The appendix stated that Foreman Hart had signed the act under protest and had submitted 3 petitions requesting to be sent to the Yaris on a combat expedition. All 3 petitions had been rejected. The resolution on the rejections was the same in each case: inappropriate. The signature beneath the resolution belonged to the manager of the mining office that had handled the Tears affairs 20 years ago. The office was called Vale and Sons. The hall buzzed. The square outside the windows roared even louder. Lance remained calm and terrifying. He asked the court who, by law, was responsible for concealing the threat. The one who had asked 3 times to be allowed to kill the creature, or the one who had written inappropriate 3 times and continued to send the work crews into the neighboring tunnels. Judge Morven looked at the papers, and Lance could see the struggle within the man between the silver he'd been paid and the square outside the window. The square won. The charges against Garth were dropped for lack of evidence right there in the courtroom. The crowd carried Garth on their shoulders from the town hall doors to the guild hall. But Lance lingered on the steps because Lord Cedric Vale blocked his path. Up close, the Lord looked calm, and that was more terrifying than a scream. He spoke quietly, just for the 2 of them. The boy had won the mob's trial. But tomorrow, a man would arrive for whom the mob was mere noise, and the boy was a line in a register. For 20 years, the War Ministry had been searching for a way to produce soldiers faster than they were being killed. Vale had offered the boy a chain bearing the house's coat of arms. The ministry would fasten a chain bearing the crown's coat of arms and ask no questions. This is the last time the House of Vales is extending a hand. As long as the house stands, the boy will remain a master. Alone, he will become state property. Lance held his gaze and replied just as quietly. The House of Vale had written inappropriate 3 times on petitions to save people. The Coin Exchange Guild does not issue such resolutions. He walked around the Lord as one would walk around a lamppost and went down to his people. The Crown Auditor entered the city the following afternoon. The motorcade turned out to be smaller than expected. 2 carriages and a dozen horsemen. A gaunt old man stepped out of the first carriage, carrying a folder. Pell, the Treasury Inspector. From the second emerged a man at the sight of whom Captain Drost snapped to attention and turned pale. Colonel Heron, the Ministry's recruiter. Drost whispered to Lenz that Heron was known in the army as the recruitment butcher and that this man had requisitioned an entire city's blacksmith shop, blacksmiths and all. The inspection was held in the guild courtyard. Pell counted. Heron watched. Lenz showed exactly what he had decided to show: the work of his contract, the ledgers, and the satisfied guild foreman. Not a single instance of combat use. The craft feeds the province and pays the treasury. Boring and indispensable. Pell nodded and jotted something down in his folder. And at the end of the inspection, Heron smiled and said he'd seen enough. He pulled out the ministry's order, prepared back in the capital. Guild Master Carver, as a practitioner of a dual-purpose craft, is subject to conscription into royal service for a term of 20 years, with a transfer to the capital's arsenal. The guild is to be transformed into a state-run manufactory. The courtyard fell silent, like a flooded gallery. Drost placed his hand on his sword, and 10 veterans moved to stand behind him. Heron smiled even wider, because resistance to the decree gave him the right to enforce it by force. And in that silence, the dry-witted Auditor Pell coughed and uttered a word no one had expected. Dismissed. He opened the folder and, in a voice as dull as his figures, read aloud the report. During the reporting week, the Coinage Guild paid more taxes to the provincial treasury than the 3 Veal mines combined. The forecast for annual revenue exceeds the maintenance costs of 2 infantry regiments. The Crown Treasury, pursuant to the Act on the Protection of Treasury Revenues, hereby vetoes the requisition of this profitable trade pending the King's decision. Heron muttered that the ministry would appeal the veto. Pell replied that this was the ministry's right, and that the appeal would be considered by the Crown within the prescribed time limit. The review period is 6 months. The colonel folded up the order, bowed with his eyes alone, and walked toward the carriage. At the gate, he turned around and told Lenz, without a smile, that in 6 months he would return, not with a piece of paper. The carriages drove off. The court breathed a sigh of relief, and Lenz looked at Auditor Pell, who was leisurely closing the folder, and suddenly understood. The tax report had been prepared in advance. The veto had been prepared in advance. The old man had come not to inspect the guild, but to shut it down. That evening, Pell received Lenz in private in the rented quarters. He was silent for a long time, then removed a key from around his neck and opened a travel chest. Inside the chest lay a stack of letters bearing a watermark of a griffin and a quill. Pell said that he served neither the ministry nor even the treasury. He served a man who, for 20 years, had been gathering throughout the kingdom those whom the ministries deemed undesirable. And this man was conveying an invitation to Master Carver. In a month, the Council of the Continent's great guilds would convene in the capital. For the first time in 40 years, a guild less than a year old had been invited to attend. Lance asked who this man was. Pell smiled for the first time that day and replied that the master was already familiar with her handwriting. She draws she-wolves. Lance derailed the trial against Garth by exposing the inappropriate resolutions of the Vale's office and publicly rejected the Lord's latest proposal. Colonel Heron, a ministry recruiter, presented an order conscripting Lance for 20 years and assigning him to a state-run factory. But Auditor Pell blocked the requisition for half a year with a pre-prepared treasury veto, after which Heron promised to return without the paperwork. Pell turned out to be an agent of a secret patroness, the painting she-wolf, who was summoning the guild to the capital in a month's time for the Council of Great Guilds. Lance spent the month leading up to the trip to the capital preparing for the assembly, which was later recalled as one endless week. The guild had grown from 21 members to 90. Drost drilled the new recruits in formation. Garth set up a hunting school. Morrell established an office and caught Vale's spies among the clerks 3 times. Lance raided the lower levels all the way to the very bottom and bought himself the bone skeleton of a stone worm, capable of withstanding a spear thrust, and the gills of a deep-sea newt that could last a quarter of an hour underwater. He now maintained his coin balance with an iron discipline never letting it fall below 100. The guild's coffers had surpassed 11,000 silver pieces, and the treasurer purchased a former grain exchange warehouse to serve as the guild hall. And at night, Lance read the papers sent by Pell regarding the Council of the Great Guilds and realized he was not going to a celebration. For 40 years, the council had been divided among 5 guilds: the Armorers of the Steel House, the Maritime League, the White Branch Healers Guild, the Grain Union, and the Golden Table of Bankers. The 6th seat had been vacant since the war. According to the charter, any of the 5 guilds could challenge a contender for the 6th seat to a trial, and failure in that trial would bar the way to the council forever. Pell wrote bluntly, the challenge was coming. The Steel House had already received a request from the Ministry of War to crush the upstart. 9 of them set out for the capital: Lenz, Mirel, Hart, Drost, Tobin, and 4 veterans. The capital stunned even those who were prepared. The city was 20 times larger than their own. 3-tiered bridges, and on every corner, newspaper boys were shouting about the monster merchant from the north. Someone had been whipping up the public in advance, and Lance had a pretty good idea who it was. The first surprise awaited them at the courtyard gate: an invitation to a reception that very evening with the head of the Golden Table, the banker Odenferre. Declining such an invitation in the capital was more costly than a slap in the face. Ferre received them in his office, where the walls were lined not with paintings, but with cashed promissory notes from kings. He was courteous, well-fed, and deadly dangerous. He proposed a simple deal. The Golden Table would support the guild at the council and secure 2 out of 5 votes. In exchange, the exchange coin would grant the table the exclusive right to extend credit to all buyers of copies. Lenz listened and saw the trap. A guildmaster who took out a loan from Fur for a copy of Power would hand over his workshop to Fur in a year. Lenz replied that the guild was flattered and would consider the offer before the council meeting. Ferrer smiled and said that thinking was useful, but not for long. On the way out, a servant slipped a note to Tobin. An anonymous well-wisher advised him to be in the healer's quarter by noon tomorrow and ask for Sister Olma. Instead of a she-wolf, there was a wolf's paw at the bottom. The next morning, the 3 of them, Leans, Morel, and Garth, set out. Sister Olma turned out to be the head healer at the White Branch shelter for maimed miners and soldiers. She led them silently through the wards. People without legs. People with lungs scorched by mine gas. Children from collapsed mine tunnels. Then she asked if the newspapers were telling the truth, that the master was selling the strength of monsters to healthy people. Lenz replied that it was true. Olma looked him in the eyes and asked if his shop could sell these people not strength, but wholeness. Lenz was silent for a long time. Then he honestly admitted that he didn't know. The she-wolf's regeneration had healed his wounds, but he had never tried to replicate it for the maimed. He set up his shop right there in the ward. He crafted a replica of the regeneration for 20 coins, and with Olma's permission, he sold it for a copper coin to a miner whose lungs had been half eaten away by gas. For an hour, nothing happened. Then the miner coughed, got up from his cot, walked to the window on his own, and began to cry. He was breathing deeply for the first time in 6 years. Olma blessed Lenz with a trembling hand and said that for 40 years, the White Branch had voted in the council as its conscience dictated, not as the Steel House commanded. By evening, half the newspapers were screaming about the miracle at the shelter. By morning, the other half was screaming because what had happened changed everything. The head of the White Branch, Supreme Healer Yenna, came to the orphanage, personally examined the miner, and addressed the reporters, declaring that the craft of the North was a gift, not a threat. The first of the 5 votes went into the pool without any deals. And at noon, the challenge they had been waiting for arrived. The Steel House demanded a trial. The charter granted the challenger the right to choose the trial, and the armor makers selected their own field. In 3 days, a duel of champions would take place in the capital's grand arena, a fighter from the Steel House versus a fighter from the exchange coin. No restrictions until surrender or death. The capital roared with excitement. Drost read the name of the armorer's champion and placed the sheet face down on the table. Grak the Hammer, former first sword of the Royal Guard. Arena champion for 7 years. 2 heads taller than Lance. Drost said he would face him himself because the boy had no business being there. Garth said he would go out. Tobin said they'd all die, but offered himself as the 3rd contender. Lance let them finish speaking and said what he'd already decided back at the arena gates. He would go out himself, not out of pride, out of calculation. The council and the capital must see not a strong guild fighter. They must see the craft itself. How a merchant without a combat class stands against the kingdom's top swordsman. If the guild fighter loses, the fighter loses. If the master loses, everything loses. But even the master's victory will buy what 10 of Drost's victories cannot. Miro whispered that Grak had killed 6 in the arena. Lance replied that he had 3 days and the best shop on the continent. That night, he laid out before him all the coins of valor he had saved up. 640. And a list of items from the top shelves of the shop that he'd been saving up for a month without spending a single coin. Goods from the Lord of the Depths. Goods from the Stone Worm. And 1 item from the very top shelf, for 500 coins, from a creature slain at the bottom of the tunnels during the last raid. A creature he hadn't even told Garth about. Lenz looked at that label and thought that in 3 days, the capital would see something no one had ever seen before. The guild had grown to 90 members. Lenz had bought the worm's bone skeleton and the newt's gills. He maintained a rule of never dropping below 100 coins, and his balance stood at 640. In the capital, the Banker Fair offered a burdensome alliance in exchange for 2 votes, and through the miracle of healing a miner with a copy of Regeneration, the guild honestly earned the White Branch's vote. At the ministry's request, the Steelhouse challenged the guild to a deadly duel of champions in 3 days, and Lance decided to face the kingdom's foremost swordsman, Grak the Hammer, himself, keeping a secret item worth 500 coins from the back shelf in reserve. Lance spent the 3 days of preparation as if in a single long breath. On the first day, he observed, Drost pulled up records of every arena where Grak had fought, and the 9 of them dissected each bout until midnight. Hammer wasn't a mindless brute. He was a school. He broke the fast with pressure, broke the strong with technique, and never repeated a combination twice. The records showed no weaknesses. On the second day, Lance traded. Through Olma and the White Branch, he manufactured and sold 11 copies of the Regeneration Potion for the disabled to the capital's workshops, and the shop returned his investment with interest. His balance rose to 720. On the third day, Lance went shopping. In the morning, he purchased a second-rank Deep Sense, upgrading his item to detect up to 80 steps, along with Sense of Intention. The description stated that the owner could sense the contraction of others' muscles a split second before they moved. In the afternoon, he bought some cave jumper tendons that doubled the sharpness of his lunge. And in the evening, he stayed alone in the hall, opened the top shelf, and spent an hour staring at a label priced at 500 coins. The item was called the Heart of the Deep Echo. The creature from the very depths had no body. It was the echo of everyone who had died in the tunnels over the past 200 years and would have killed the entire squad if it hadn't been vulnerable to Morel's ice at the moment it sang. The item description was just 1 line. Once a day, for 10 heartbeats, the owner ceases to be where he is. Lance clicked, buy. There was no pain. There was cold, as if a winter river had been poured into his chest and left there. The day of the arena drew 80,000 people. The council's box, the crown's box was empty but open, which was taken as a sign. The ministry's box, where Colonel Heron sat with the face of a man who had come to his execution in good spirits. Grotch the Hammer emerged to a roar, clad in the full armor of the House of Steel, wielding a 2-handed hammer carried by 2 squires. Lance stepped out in a leather doublet with a miner's pick, and the arena burst into laughter. The laughter lasted 30 seconds, and Lance stood there calmly, just as he once had in the Hall of Awakening. He was the best in the world at it. The gong sounded, and the laughter died down. For the first minute, the Capitol didn't understand what it was seeing. The hammer swung toward where Lance had been and struck where he was no longer standing. His second-rank intuition read Grack a split second before he did. The jumper's ligaments carried Lance out of the way of the blows that were shattering the arena's marble. He didn't attack. He was studying the style in real time, just as he had studied it in the recordings on the third day. In the second minute, Grack adjusted his strategy. He was a champion and understood the key point. The boy could see the wind-up. So Grack began striking without a wind-up, delivering short jabs with the iron-shod shaft, relying not on strength, but on frequency. One jab landed. Lance was sent flying halfway across the arena, and the worm's bony frame cracked, but withstood a blow that would have broken a horse's ribs. The arena gasped as the merchant stood up. In the third minute, Lance began to fight back. A hook against a hammer is laughable, but the hook was catching on the ring of the shoulder guard, on the strap of the greaves. Every hair's breadth hook deflected Grack's blows and stoked the champion's rage. And that rage fueled his momentum. Lance worked like his father on a runaway minecar. Unstoppable. Unstoppable! By the fifth minute, both realized the duel had reached a critical point. Grack was breathing heavily, but his training held him together like a skeleton. Lance held his ground, but a single missed jab would decide everything. And then, Grack did what he hadn't shown in 7 years, the royal combo. A feint to the high, a transition to the low, and the hammer swung in a wide arc toward the knees as he spun his whole body around. There was no escaping this combination. It covered all escape routes. Lance sensed it in an instant and realized the same thing. There was no way out. And he ceased to be where he had been. The Capitol watched as the hammer passed through the void. For 10 heartbeats, Lance was nowhere to be found. On the 11th, he was behind Grack, his hook at the throat, just above the seam of the armor. The arena was so silent you could hear the council's flag fluttering in the wind. Grack the hammer stood motionless. Then he slowly unclenched his hands, and the hammer crashed against the marble. The champion raised his palm and spread his fingers. He surrendered. He turned to Lenz and declared to the silent arena that for 30 years he had sought a battle that steel could not decide. He had found it. The arena erupted so violently that birds took flight from the rooftops of neighboring blocks. In the council box, the head of the House of Steel, the old armorer Brand, stood and silently bowed his head. A gesture that, according to the bylaws, signified acceptance of the trial. The ministry's box was empty. Harren had left before it ended. That evening, the Council of Five convened for a closed-door session and announced its decision the next morning. The White Branch was in favor. The House of Steel was in favor, on the grounds of the trial's honor. The Bread Union was in favor. The Sea League was in favor. The Golden Table abstained, and Ferr smiled as he did so, like a man whose value had just risen. By a vote of 4-1, the Coin Exchange Guild was granted the 6th seat on the Council of the Great Guilds of the continent. Not yet a year old. Lance accepted the chain of office in the council chamber and scanned the crowd for a single face. He didn't know which one. He knew she was here. And she was. When the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, a woman approached him, wearing a simple gray dress, with gray streaks in her hair and a claw mark across her left wrist. She said that 26 years ago, she had been known as General Sarah Wolfe, commander of the Northern Army. Then the ministry labeled her army inefficient and disbanded it in the middle of the war, while those who survived were erased from the records. Ever since then, she has been gathering the inefficient ones. Pell is her treasurer. Olma is her sister.
and she paints the gray-haired she-wolf because that was the name of her army. She looked at Lens with the eyes of an old she-wolf and said what mattered most. The ministry will return in half a year, and it won't be coming for the guild.
In the north, beyond the mountain range, that which her army stood against 26 years ago is awakening. This city's tunnels are merely the farthest edge of that depth, and when it awakens, the continent will need more than a regiment of soldiers. The continent will need a merchant who knows how to turn ordinary people into an elite. She held out her hand.
Lens shook it and felt that the chain on his chest now weighed twice as much. Lens purchased a second-rank Sense of the Depths ability, along with the Jumper's bundle for reading intentions, and the secret item, Heart of the Deep Echo, which emits 10 heartbeats of non-existence once a day.
In the arena, he defeated Grok the Hammer, who surrendered and acknowledged his craft, and the council, by a vote of 4-1, with Foray abstaining, granted the guild its 6th seat. The patroness revealed herself to be General Syra Wolf of the disbanded Grey She-Wolf Army, a force that gathers the misfits. She warned that beyond the northern ridge, an ancient depth was awakening, the very cause for which her army had stood, and that the ministry would return in half a year, while the continent would need Lens's craft. The return home turned out to be shorter than she'd hoped. 2 weeks after the council, a messenger from Sarah galloped up to the guild hall in the north with a single word written on a piece of paper bearing the wolf's emblem. It had begun. Beyond the ridge, the upper settlements were shaken. 3 villages vanished overnight from the old mines of the Principality of Harlan. They hadn't burned down, nor had their inhabitants fled. They had simply vanished. The houses stood untouched, but the people were gone, and the snow all around lay without a single footprint. The Principality requested assistance from the Crown, and the ministry received its long-awaited pretext. Colonel Heron led an expeditionary corps of 5,000 soldiers northward, carrying a decree signed by the king. Martial law was declared in the disaster zone, and all dual-use industries within that zone came under the army's control. The disaster zone was demarcated to encompass the entire city of Lensa. Sira wrote bluntly. Heron had no intention of waiting half a year to appeal the veto. He intended to let the depths do all the work for him. The Corps would set up camp and watch as the North went under. And when the city fell to its knees, the ministry would seize the trade just as one seizes a drowning man, in the name of salvation. Lens convened the guild council that very night. By that day, the guild numbered 240 members and had 8 branches in cities across the province. Drost proposed fortifying the city. Garth proposed striking first, crossing the mountain range, and engaging the creatures in the narrow passes. Morel remained silent, making calculations on her slate. Then she read the numbers aloud. 60 people have copies of the combat items. That might be enough against the 3 vanished villages. It certainly wouldn't be enough against whatever forced the Crown to send 5,000 soldiers. Lance listened to everyone and studied the map of the mountain range. Then he spoke his mind. The guild would neither hide nor play the hero. The guild would do what it does better than anyone else on the continent. It will open up trade. If the depths are sending monsters, that means the monsters can be defeated. If the monsters can be defeated, that means the shop will stock goods that no army has ever even dreamed of. Every raid into the mountain range is a procurement mission. Every procurement makes the next raid easier. For any army, war with the depths is an expense. For the exchange coin, it's revenue. Garth was the first to start laughing. Then Drost. Then the entire council. The laughter was wicked and justified. The first reconnaissance raid set out beyond the ridge 3 days later. Lens led it himself, taking Morel Tobin and his 6 best men. They found the vanished village of Kovj by evening, and the Deep's intuition began to speak of Verst before they reached the outskirts. Beneath the village, it was empty. Not empty as in devoid of people. Empty as in bottomless. The intuition that could pierce stone 80 paces deep plunged into nothingness beneath Kovj. The answer was found in a well. Its shaft, which appeared on no map, descended, perfectly round and smooth as if cast from a mold. Tobin dropped a stone, but they never heard the sound of it hitting the bottom. The creatures arrived at dusk. There were 7 of them, and they were misshapen. Tall figures made of compressed darkness, each with a face.
Each had a human face, and Lance, with an icy shudder, recognized the face of the Kovsh village headman from the guild census. The creatures did not attack. They stood at the edge of the village and watched. And then the one bearing the village elder's face spoke in a voice as dry as a scree, and said that the depth does not wage war. The depth gathers. Everyone who has descended over the past 200 years is now a part of it, and everyone taken becomes a part of it.
She suggested they not resist, because down there is no pain and no debts. Morel stepped forward and struck with ice without waiting to hear the rest. The ice passed through the figure as though through smoke.
And the figure leaned toward Morel and touched her shoulder. Morel screamed. From then on, Lance acted on instinct in the truest sense of the word. His second-rank intuition saw in the figures what his eyes could not. The core, a point not of darkness, but of condensed echo in the center of the chest. Lance shouted to Tobin to strike at his mark, yanked a flask of lamp oil from his belt, and set the darkness around the core of the nearest creature ablaze. The darkness burned reluctantly, but burned nonetheless, and as it burned, it lost its shape, and then Tobin's arrow into the core extinguished the echo once and for all. 7 creatures lay dead within a quarter of an hour, costing the squad frostbite and a gray strand of hair for Tobin. Morel was breathing, but her shoulder, where the creature had touched her, had turned gray and cold as stone. The bench clattered, and for the first time in a long while, Lance froze in front of the shelf. The Deep Walker's merchandise was called Memories of the Taken and cost 90 coins apiece. The description stated that the owner would receive the memories of the final hour of the person whose face the Deep Walker bore. Lance bought the village elder's memory without hesitation, and he saw. Night. A rumbling from the well. The light below was soft and warm, like that from a hearth. A voice from within the light, calling out in the voices of deceased loved ones. And the most terrifying thing of all, the people of Kovsh were walking into the well of their own accord, smiling. They rode back, herding their horses. 2 people were waiting for Lenz in the city. Sira, who had come in person, and a military surgeon from Heron's Corps, secretly sent by the officers. The surgeon reported that the Corps had set up camp a day's journey from the ridge, and that, over the course of 3 nights, 40 soldiers had deserted from the camp toward the ridge. The deserters were heading north, smiling, and Heron had already signed the order to shoot at his own men. Sarah listened to Lenz's report about the well and the voice, and she aged before our eyes. She said that 26 years ago, her army hadn't been fighting monsters. The monsters came later. First, there was the call. And her army wasn't disbanded because of the ministry's stupidity, but because 1 in 10 of her soldiers had risen one night and marched northward, smiling. The ministry had buried the truth along with the army. The depth is not a fortress that can be taken. The depth is a voice that must not be given listeners. And now the voice had 5,000 listeners right under its nose in Heron's camp, and an entire city behind them. Lenz listened, and inside him, things that had never come together before finally did. Morel's gray shoulder, the elder's memory, the warm light below. He opened the shop and stared for a long time at the very last shelf where new merchandise had appeared after the raid. The price was written in a number Lenz had never seen in the shop before. 3,000 coins of valor. The item's name consisted of 2 words. Voice of the Depths. The depths beyond the ridge had claimed 3 villages, with a call that drew people away of their own accord. Smiling, while Heron's corps of 5,000 soldiers had taken up position at the ridge and was already losing deserters to the wells. During the raid, Lance had learned to kill the walkers by igniting the darkness and shooting an arrow into their core. He bought the memories of those he'd captured and learned the mechanics of the call, while Morel received a gray stone shoulder from the creature's touch. Sarah discovered that her army had been disbanded because of the call. An item appeared in the shop. Voice of the Depths for 3,000 coins of valor. 3,000 coins of valor was a number beyond the realm of possibility. Lenz's entire balance after the raid was 410. But Lenz looked at the label and realized that this item was not a luxury, but the only key. Everything else was the arithmetic of war. He convened a meeting of the Guild Council and Sarah and laid out the plan he'd been mulling over all night. Valor coins are awarded for contributions to victory. That meant the guild didn't need defense, it needed the longest winning streak in its history. The mountain range is cut through by 9 passes and old tunnels. Travelers make their way to their homes along these routes. The guild turns every path into a trap and grinds the creatures down in droves. The goal isn't to hold the north, the goal is to earn 3,000 coins before the call reaches the city and the camp. Sarah asked what the goods offered for such a price. Lance honestly replied that the description is hidden until purchase, and that he's betting everything on the single line that's visible. The owner hears what the recruits hear. Drost said the plan was insane because 60 fighters wouldn't be enough to hold 9 passes. Lenz replied that 600 would be enough. And he revealed the second part of the plan. The guild was announcing a military draft with payment in copies. After training, each volunteer would receive a combat kit consisting of 3 copies on credit, to be repaid with future shares from raids. The city looked out at the vanished villages, and there was no shortage of volunteers. Meanwhile, Heron's surgeon carried the third and most daring proposal to the camp. The guild was offering the corps an alliance, not soldiers under Lance's command, but joint outposts where the army's steel would stand as a wall, and the guild's eyes and goods would make that wall see. Heron publicly burned the proposal. But Lenz hadn't been counting on Heron anyway. He was counting on the officers, who every morning found themselves short of smiling deserters. What followed were 2 weeks that the North would remember forever. Weeks marked by a barrage of fire and precise accounting. The city's smithies forged grappling hooks and oil bombs around the clock. Drost drilled the recruits for 10 hours a day. Garth and the veterans manned the passes and tunnels with traps based on Lenz's blueprints, where burning trenches herded the attackers into the line of fire with targeted shots. The first attack on the Crooked Tooth Pass was repelled on the very first night, and the shop awarded the defensive line a total of 190 coins among them all. Lenz shuttled sleeplessly between the barricades, buying upgrades and selling copies, and his personal balance crept upward. 600. 900. 1,200. The walkers changed. Depth was learning. By the second week, the creatures came faceless, sleek, and fast, and the burning oil was less effective against them. Then, for the first time, the call reached through the barricades. On the night of the 9th day at the Mulchin Pass, an entire barricade shift of 12 recruits left their posts and walked toward the well, smiling. They were caught up with, bound, and brought to the city. Once untied, they wept and had no memory of the call. And Olma, who had arrived with the White Branches supply train, discovered a pattern that made Lenz's teeth grind. The call took those who were in despair, debtors, widowers, those who had nothing to lose. The Depths offered them exactly what Lord Vale had once offered Lenz: an end to their debts. Lenz looked at the bound recruits and saw himself in the Hall of Awakening. And then he made a move that the council did not understand at first. The guild announced that it would buy out the debts of its fighters and their families from all the moneylenders of the North. 11,000 silver coins from the treasury were spent in 3 days, and the treasurer clutched his heart. But from that night on, not a single barrier fighter failed to answer the call. The Depths had nothing left to offer them. Sarah, upon hearing about the debt redemption, was silent for a long time, and then said that 26 years ago, no one, including herself, had thought of this. On the 15th day, what they had been waiting for happened. The Depths stopped filtering out creatures and struck in earnest. From the tunnels of the ash mines, the very ones where Lenz had once bought his first haul. Not 7, not 70, but 1,500 runners emerged in a single night. And the column headed not for the mountain passes, but through the valley, straight toward the corpse's camp. The depths were followed by 5,000 listeners. A messenger from the Corps' officers rushed into the city at dawn. Heron had formed the Corps into a square on the plain, as one does against cavalry, and it was suicide because the walkers didn't need formation. They needed night and despair, and the soldiers, who hadn't been paid their wages for a month, had more than enough despair to go around. Lance gathered everything that could be used as a weapon. 380 guild fighters set out for the plain at a forced march, and Lance made one last purchase along the way. By morning, the total stood at 2,840. They were short 160 coins to reach the voice of the depths. Instead, he bought something cheap but necessary. For 200 coins, the ability to issue commands directly into the minds of all fighters during battle, without shouting or messengers, from the choir of the Depth Walkers. They reached the plain an hour before sunset. Below lay the camp of the 5,000-strong Corps, arranged in a square. From the north, a column of walkers flowed toward it, resembling a river of pitch. And above the plain, the call was already drifting. And for the first time, Lance heard it himself on the edge of the new chorus. Warm, familiar. His father's voice calling him to cut and run and go down where it doesn't hurt. Lenz clenched his teeth, gave the command to the barricades in unison, and 380 men of the exchange coin marched down the hill to cut across the river of pitch. 100 paces before the clash, Lenz saw what decided the fate of the evening. The gates of the square swing wide open, and the Corps launched a counterattack. Not on Heron's orders. Heron was being supported by his own aides. The Corps was led by officers who had once received an offer of alliance. Steel rose like a wall. The guild had built a wall of sight, and so began the longest night of the North. The guild deployed a force, paid for with copies, to block the 9 mountain passes and spent 2 weeks grinding down the walkers, raising Lance's balance to nearly 3,000, while the redemption of all the fighters' debts stripped the Call of Power of its authority over them. The Depth struck the Corps' camp with a column of 1,500 walkers of the Corps, and Lenz, falling short of the Depth's demand by 160 coins, purchased a choir for mental commands. Defying Heron, the Corps' officers launched a counterattack in alliance with the exchange coin, and a nighttime battle began on the plain. The night on the plain was not divided into hours. It was divided into waves. The first wave was met with fiery trenches that the guild sappers had cut into the turf while the Corps held its formation. The pitch burned, and in the light of the burning pitch, archers with eagle eyes struck at the centers that Lenz's choir had designated for them. Lenz stood on a mound in the middle of the position and commanded not with a hook but with his mind. His voice carried through the chorus to his 400 men, and via the officers to thousands of soldiers. He sensed the entire plain with his intuition, just as a father senses a mine by the rumble of the supports. The pressure is building here. It's empty here. It's about to burst here. The second wave surged at the junctions between the Corps and the guild, and the junctions held because Lenz had sealed them off with Drost's reserves before the beasts could reach them. The third wave didn't come at all. Instead, a call of such power rang out that the fire in the trenches died down. The voice of the depths no longer pretended to be familiar. It struck at the simplest of truths. Tired, lay down. It's quiet down below. Across the plain, soldiers lowered their shields, and Lance felt as if in unison, thousands of minds drifting toward the edge. And then he did something no army would ever have thought of. He opened a trade through the chorus right in the midst of battle. To everyone who heard him, he offered a deal with the voice of a fairground barker. The depths will buy you in exchange for silence. The exchange coin pays more. To anyone who survives until dawn, a copy of Power from my shop is yours to keep. And I, the merchant with the 6th seat on the council, never bargain at a loss. At first, a chuckle rippled across the plain. Then roars of laughter, 5,000 throats roared with laughter at the creatures from the abyss, because the merchant in the midst of the end of the world had announced a clearance sale. The call cracked. The call knew how to speak with despair, but did not know how to speak with laughter. The shields rose. By the fourth wave, Lens realized that victory that night was impossible, and that it wasn't what was needed. The walkers were dying out more slowly than humans. The source had to be sealed off. His instincts had guided him throughout the battle, and by 3 o'clock in the morning, he found it. The river of resin did not originate in the tunnels. It poured out of a single shaft. The old ventilation shaft of the ash mines at the far edge of the plain was smooth and round, just like the one in the ladle. Lance assembled a strike force of 30 of the best and led them himself, handing command of the plain over to Drost and Sira, who stood on the mound as if she hadn't left it in 26 years. The breakthrough to the shaft cost them 9 wounded and 1 dead. A veteran of Drost named Colum shielded Tobin with his own body, and Lens remembered this as one remembers a debt. Right at the mouth of the shaft, Lens's choir caught a sound that made his knees buckle. It wasn't a monster singing from below. Hundreds of human voices, merged into one, were singing from below, and in that chorus, Lance made out the voice of Elder Kufsh and the voices of the 3 Artels who had gone missing 20 years ago. And at the very bottom, a faint but living voice that he could not mistake for anything else, because he had heard it every day of his childhood. His father's voice. The bench clattered right above the chasm. The system reported that 700 coins of valor had been awarded for the defense of the plain in recognition of his decisive contribution. Balance, 3,380. The Voice of the Depths item is available. Lance stood above the singing abyss, his finger trembling over the label. To buy it meant to hear what the taken hear. Perhaps to find out that his father was alive. Perhaps to discover that whatever lay below could carry voices the way walkers carry faces. Mirel grabbed his hand and said that down below because the creature at the bucket also spoke in the voices of loved ones. Lens replied that he knew. And he bought it. The world vanished. 10 heartbeats later, Lens was no longer on the plain. He was everywhere the depth was, and he heard all of it. And the truth turned out to be worse than a lie, and better than a lie at the same time. The taken were alive, not in their bodies. The depth dissolved their bodies, but it preserved their consciousnesses, just as a store keeps goods on its shelves, hundreds and hundreds of little lights, in an eternal, warm half-sleep. The depth was not evil. The depth was a hunger older than words, which for 200 years had hoarded people, just as Lance had hoarded coins. And now, having reached some limit, had begun to spend them. To build from the accumulated bodies and armies. And at the very core of the hunger, Lance saw what made him gasp for breath. A structure. Painfully familiar. Accrual. Accumulation. Exchange. The depth was a shop. An ancient, bottomless shop without an owner, which had been trading with itself for 200 years. And his own class, his shop, his coins of valor, these were not mere gifts of the system. They were a shard of that depth that had burst upward on the day of awakening and taken the sight of the people. Lance emerged from the vision onto his knees. Morel was shaking him by the shoulders. He raised his head and spoke 2 words that changed the entire war. It's open to negotiation. The depth cannot be killed with steel because it is not a body. But a deal can be struck with the shop, because a deal is the only language the shop understands. Down below, on the depth's shelves, lie thousands of human consciousnesses. They can be bought back. The only question is the price, and whether the continent has enough of the currency the abyss will accept. Lance stood up and looked east. The sky was turning gray. The plain behind him roared with one last wave, but he already knew they had weathered the night. Dawn broke, and the walkers receded into the well like an ebbing tide. On the plain, amid the fires and the dead, 5,000 soldiers and 400 guild members were still standing, and when they realized they were still standing, they began to shout and embrace one another. and Lance gazed into the now quiet chasm and for the first time in his life prepared for negotiations in which he could not afford to make even the slightest mistake. Below, the largest business partner in the history of trade awaited him. And somewhere out there, on a distant shelf, his father waited. The plane had been defended through the night by an alliance of the Corps and the Guild. Moreover, Lance had broken the stalemate by opening trade in the midst of battle, shouting over the chorus of voices and provoking the laughter of 5,000 soldiers, while the veteran column had perished shielding Tobin. The voice of the depths, purchased for 3,000, revealed the truth. The depths are an ancient, bottomless storehouse without a master, preserving on its shelves the consciousnesses of all those taken alive, including Lance's father, and Lance's class is a fragment of these depths. The depths cannot be killed, but one can bargain with them, and Lance is preparing a deal to redeem thousands of consciousnesses. A week after the battle, the North buried its dead and calculated the cost. The Corps lost 210 men. The Guild lost 18. Lenz personally entered every name into the Guild's register, and next to Column's name, recorded a debt that could not be repaid with silver. Harron's officers were sent to the capital under escort with a report on the failure to fulfill command duties, and along with the report went a letter from Sira to the people she had placed in various offices over the past 26 years. The Crown's reply arrived 9 days later and was not signed by a ministry. By royal decree, command of the Northern Campaign was transferred to a joint command consisting of 3 individuals: General Wolfe, representing the Crown; the Regimental Officers' Council, representing the Army; Master Carver, representing the Guild Council. The decree instructed the ministry to ensure supplies and not to interfere. Sira read the decree aloud and said she had been waiting 26 years for this document. But Lenza was no longer preoccupied with paperwork. He was preparing a deal. For 7 days, he delved with his mind into the depths through the purchased voice. For 1 hour a day, his consciousness could not endure any longer, and learned the language of the abyss. The depths did not speak in words. It spoke in balances. And after 7 days, Lance understood its accounting. The depths accepted only one currency: voluntary surrender. A consciousness surrendered by force or deception had no value to it at all. That is why it did not take those fallen in battle, but sang its call for 200 years. The one who left was worth everything. And for that same reason, a ransom was possible. A consciousness that someone wished to redeem, and that wished to leave of its own accord. The depths were obligated to evaluate and sell, because refusing the deal would have gone against their very nature. The question was the price. And the depths named their price when Lance first officially opened negotiations. For every consciousness, the depths demanded an equivalent in return, another consciousness that had voluntarily placed itself on the shelf. Lenz snapped out of his trance, white as a sheet. The abyss's exchange rate was 1 human for 1 human. The command council convened that same evening, and Lenz laid everything out honestly. Sarah was silent for a long time, then said that there would be hundreds of suicide candidates willing to be placed on the shelf for other people's children, and that this would be the most terrifying arithmetic in history. Lance replied that a merchant who accepts the seller's first asking price is no merchant at all. Every counterparty has something they need more than the stated price. One only needs to understand what a starving man needs, one who has been hoarding for 200 years and has only just begun to spend. And Lance understood this that very night, poring over the guild ledger and staring at the line about the redemption of fighters' debts. The depth sang to the desperate. The depth did not feed on people. It fed on their consent, and that consent was born of hopelessness. The depth was not a predator. The depth was a loan shark. It gave the desperate peace of mind at an interest rate no one bothered to read. And what does a moneylender need more than a one-time payment? A steady stream. Lenz spent 3 days calculating with Morel and the treasurer, And on the fourth day, he descended into a trance with a proposal he called the Contract of Eternal Circulation. The depth releases all those it has taken, all regiments at once. In exchange, the exchange coin grants the depth something it has never had before. An honest shop up above. Every person on the continent who dies a natural death in harmony and peace gains the right to voluntarily bequeath their consciousness to the depths, just as one bequeaths property. The guild maintains a registry, teaches people that what lies down there is not torment but shelves, and assumes the role of eternal mediator. Instead of the hundreds stolen by the call over 200 years, the depths receive a voluntary flow forever. A genuine one, a pure one that grows along with the continent's population. A one-time plunder versus an eternal cycle. The depths were silent for 3 heartbeats that lasted an hour. Lens hung in black nothingness and felt an ancient hunger counting for the first time in 200 years. Then the abyss answered, and the answer was a question. Who guarantees a contract lasting for eternity if the merchant is mortal? And Lens gave the answer he had been preparing from the moment he learned the nature of his class. The class itself would serve as the guarantor, the fragment of the abyss living within him. Lance's shop would return to the abyss after his death and carry the contract to its very core, making the agreement part of the abyss's nature. His gift for all those taken. Up above, at the mouth of the well, 6 hours had passed. Morel was already eager to descend after him with the squad when Lance opened his eyes. He looked haggard from exhaustion, but was smiling. He said the deal was sealed and that the depths had demanded only one addition, a down payment on the future flow. One consciousness, given voluntarily, now serving as a seal on the contract. It grew very quiet. Dross stepped forward and said he was old, and agreed. Garth pushed him aside and said he was the old one here. Sarah silently removed her gloves. And then from behind them, a man they hadn't been expecting stepped forward. The fleet surgeon had brought him from the infirmary the day before. A veteran of Sarah's 1st Northern Army, he was 40 years old, broken by that very war, legless and sleepless, screaming in pain every night for a quarter of a century. He said he'd heard the call all these years and had held on only out of stubbornness, and now they were offering him not to give up, but to pay with his own life for thousands, and for the first time in 40 years, he was needed. He asked for the honor. Sarah knelt before his stretcher and addressed him by name and rank. Standard Bearer Yorick. At dawn the next day, everyone gathered at the mouth of the well. Yorick was lowered to the very edge. He laughed and joked that this was the first time he was going into battle while lying down. Then he fell silent, looked at the brightening sky, and said he was ready. A glow rose from the well, soft and warm, and Yorick stepped into it, smiling. But for the first time, that smile was not a theft, but a fair payment. And then the earth sighed. Light rose from the mouth of the well, from the tunnels, from all the wells of the north, and people walked in that light, the living. In flesh that the depths had yielded along with their consciousnesses, for an honest deal tolerates no shortfall. The inhabitants of Kovsh, members of the collective from 20 years ago, not a day older. Soldiers of Sierra's army in tattered uniforms. Heron's deserters, hundreds upon hundreds of people squinting in the sun. The plain howled and wept. Sarah stood among her soldiers, whom she had been bearing for 26 years, and could not speak. And Lens stood by the mouth of the shaft and waited, gazing at the light until his eyes ached. And he waited. A man emerged from the light, wearing a miner's overalls with a pickaxe at his belt. He squinted, looked at the council chain on Lance's chest and at the guild banner above the well, and grumbled that he'd left his son for 3 years and the boy had managed to get into all sorts of trouble. Lens stepped forward and, for the first time since the Hall of Awakening, allowed himself to let his guard down. The Crown had transferred command of the campaign to Sarah's officers and Lens, sidelining the ministry, while Heron was taken away under escort. Lenz had studied the nature of the usurer's abyss, which fed on the voluntary consent of the desperate, and had concluded a contract of eternal circulation. The abyss releases all those taken in the flesh in exchange for an eternal, voluntary stream of bequeathed consciousnesses through the mediation of the guild, with the guarantee being Lance's own class, which would return to the abyss after his death. The seal of this agreement was the voluntary departure of the maimed standard-bearer, Yorek. The abyss returned hundreds of people, including Sarah's army, villagers, and Lance's father. A year later, the town near the ash tunnels was unrecognizable. It was now called Northern Scales, and caravans from 3 sides of the continent passed through it. Near the old spillway stood a building unlike any other in the world, the Chamber of the Quiet Shore, where the guild's notaries and the Sisters of the White Branch kept a registry of wills, bequeathing property to the depths. Over the course of a year, 11,000 people had signed voluntary wills, and most of them were elderly people who entered the chamber calm and left at peace, because death had ceased to be a precipice and had become a move. The depths kept their end of the bargain impeccably. The call fell silent throughout the north. The wells stood open, and warmth wafted from them. Twice a year, the depths, of their own accord, returned those who had bequeathed themselves but had changed their minds on the ledge, and the chamber would amend the contract to include a right of repurchase. Lenz personally negotiated this amendment for 4 hours in a trance and emerged from it with a gray hair at his temple at the age of 19. The Coin Exchange Guild numbered 3,000 masters in 40 cities. The charter that Lenz finalized that winter prohibited the sale of copies to armies as a whole and permitted sales only to individuals by name, with their names recorded in the register. According to his vision, the power was to remain a craft, not an arsenal. The Council of 5 became the Council of 6, and at the very first meeting of the new council, Lance pushed through a law banning debt bondage across the entire continent. The Golden Table was the sole dissenting vote. When they met, Fair told Lance that the boy had taken the best merchandise away from the banks. Lance replied that he had left the banks with the best of what remained: fair interest. After Sarah's army returned from the interior, the Ministry of War underwent what the newspapers called a great purge. The returning soldiers remembered everything, including the orders they had been sent out under and the paperwork they had been discharged with. Heron was stripped of his rank. The word inappropriate was banned from use in military contexts by royal decree. And Sarah hung this decree in a frame in her new office as head of the Northern District. The House of Vales collapsed without a single blow from Lenz. The guild members who had returned 20 years later filed lawsuits based on old resolutions from the Vale and Sons firm, and Lord Cedric sold the mines to settle the debts. The guild bought the mines and, as its first act, implemented the father's safety regulations there. Dorian Vale was left without an inheritance, and Lance did something that no one but Morell understood. He offered Dorian a position at the guild's hunting school as a rank-and-file instructor, with the status of a knight. Dorian didn't respond for 3 days, but on the 4th day, he arrived at the school before dawn and silently began working. Garth grumbled that Lance was recruiting people even more unsuitable than Syrah. Lance replied that he'd learned the trade from the best. Lance's father turned down all the positions and returned to the mine as a shift foreman, saying he'd been on the shelf for 3 years and had rested up enough for the rest of his life. On Sundays, he would come to the guild hall for lunch, scold his son for not getting enough sleep, and inspect his palms just as he used to when he used to inspect fasteners. For the first month after the debt was paid off, Lenz's mother cried every time she saw the receipt framed above the hearth. Lenz had glued the receipt, which had been torn in half, back together and hung it up himself, to remind himself of where a person's worth begins. Tobin became head of the guild's intelligence division, and his gray strand of hair was a hit with the capital's young ladies, a fact he talked about more often than he should have. Drost took command of the guild guard. Captain Grok Hammer joined the guild a month after the council meeting and now taught newcomers a lesson, saying he was teaching them what he himself had been unable to defend against. And in the fall, Lenz brought Morell to the Silent Shore Chamber, not on registry business. By the well. Where a year earlier people had stepped out of the light, he spoke with her at length and incoherently, for a man who had negotiated with the abyss. And she took pity on him and said yes, before he could get to the point. The whole city celebrated the wedding, and the abyss sent a gift. That night, pillars of quiet, warm light rose above all the wells of the north and remained there until morning. The elders said that the abyss was singing, but for the first time in 200 years, it was not calling. It was offering congratulations. In the spring, the last letter from the she-wolf arrived. Sarah wrote briefly. Beyond the western sea, envoys speak of their own depths and their own calls, and the crown asks the Council of Six whether Master Carver is ready to teach others the language in which one speaks with the abyss. Lance read the letter on the threshold of the shop, not the one in the corner of his vision, the real one. A year ago, he'd opened a shop in Northern Scales, with a door and a counter, where anyone could order a copy of a power, sign up for a raid, or simply ask the master for advice. His father had built the counter for him himself out of planks from that first overturned cart of Garth's. Lance finished reading the letter and looked out at the square. There, academy students were running to their morning classes, and among them was a boy in a gray cloak, lugging a street vendor's box on his back. Everyone was passing him by. Lance called out to him and asked what class he'd been assigned upon awakening. The boy puffed out his chest and replied that he was an F-rank accountant and that people could laugh without having to wait in line. Lenz smiled and said there would be no need to wait in line. He opened the shop door for the boy and spoke the words that would later be carved above the entrance to all 40 branches of the guild. In this world, there are no useless classes. There are only unread descriptions. The boy stepped inside skeptically. Lenz stood in the doorway, gazing northward, where open wells glowed with warm light beyond the ridge. Somewhere down there, deep among the shelves, lay his contract, one destined to outlive him and become the law of the abyss. The continent's worst-class merchant thought the deal had been fair. He had given his future inheritance to the depths. The depths had given the people their dead and their peace. And everything in between he had earned himself, by the skin of his teeth, through the ledger, and by a rule he had deduced even before the first goblin pit. It is not the one to whom power is given who wins. It is the one who knows its value who wins. Lance entered the shop and closed the door behind him. Work awaited him behind the counter. The contract with the depths operates through the chamber of the quiet shore with a right of repurchase. The call fell silent, and death became a move. The House of Vales fell following lawsuits filed by those who had returned. The ministry was purged. Heron was convicted. The word inappropriate was banned, and Dorian was accepted as an instructor. The guild in 40 cities enacted a ban on debt bondage. The father returned to the mine. Lance married Morel and opened a real shop with a motto about unread descriptions, taking on a new boy with an F-rank class. A week after the battle, the North buried the dead and calculated the cost. The Corps lost 210 men. The Guild lost 18. They were buried together on a hill overlooking the plain, soldiers alongside Guild members, without distinction, and Dross said over the graves that for the first time in 30 years of service, he was seeing a cemetery where there were no strangers. Lance personally entered each name of the fallen into the Guild's register, along with a description of what the person had done on their last night. Next to Column's name, he recorded a debt that could not be repaid with silver, and ordered that Column's family receive a veteran's share for life, and that his son receive the first copy free of charge when he came of age. Tobin read this entry and left the hall. He returned an hour later with red eyes and asked to be transferred to the most distant reconnaissance units. Lance transferred him. The officer sent Heron to the capital under escort with a report on his failure to fulfill his duty as a commander. The colonel's aide, while testifying, explained that on the night of the battle, Heron had forbidden the opening of the square's gates, and the officers had the order by a vote of the regimental council, something that had not happened in the Royal Army since its founding. Along with the report went a letter from Sierra to the people she had been placing in offices and archives for 26 years. The Crown's reply arrived 9 days later and was not signed by a ministry. By royal decree, command of the Northern Campaign was transferred to a joint command consisting of 3 individuals. General Wolfe, representing the Crown. The Regimental Council of Officers, representing the Army. Master Carver from the Council of Guilds. The decree instructed the ministry to ensure supplies and not to interfere. Sarah read the decree aloud twice. Then she folded the paper and said that she had been waiting 26 years for this wording, and that now they could get to work. But Lensa was no longer preoccupied with the paperwork. He was preparing a deal. For 7 days, he descended in thought into the depths through a purchased voice for 1 hour a day because his consciousness could no longer endure it. After each descent, Olma gave him herbal teas and forbade him from speaking for 2 hours. Morel sat next to a slate and wrote down everything he brought back from his trances until the words became jumbled. Thus, bit by bit, Lance learned the language of the abyss. The depths did not speak in words. They spoke in balances. The image of scales. The image of a shelf. The image of exchange. And after 7 days, Lance understood their accounting down to the very last entry. The depths accepted only one currency: voluntariness. A consciousness surrendered by force or deception was of no value to her at all. That is why, in 200 years, she had not taken a single one who had fallen in battle, and that is why she sang a call instead of simply killing. The one who left of his own accord was worth everything. The one who left joyfully was worth even more. And for that same reason, a ransom was possible. A consciousness that someone wished to redeem and that wished to leave the shelf of its own accord, the depth was obligated to appraise and sell, because refusing an honest offer went against her very nature, just as refusing to bargain ruins a fair. The question was the price, and the depth named that price when Lance first officially opened the bidding. For each consciousness, the depth demanded an equivalent in return, another consciousness that had voluntarily placed itself on the shelf in exchange. Lance emerged from his trance as white as chalk and couldn't warm his hands for a long time. The depth's exchange rate was 1 human for 1 human. The command council convened that same evening, and Lance laid everything out honestly, without sugarcoating it. According to his calculations, there were about 4,000 consciousnesses on the abyss's shelves, accumulated over 2 centuries, that had emerged from trances. A 1-to-1 exchange rate meant 4,000 volunteers. Sarah was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. Then she said that there would be hundreds of martyrs willing to be placed on the shelf in exchange for other people's children. The elderly, the terminally ill, those who felt guilty toward the memory of the dead, and that this would be the most terrifying arithmetic in history because no honest person would agree to command such a line. Hart said he'd rather lie down himself than start such a list. DeRost remained silent, and Lance could see that the old captain had already begun the list for himself with his own name. Lenz replied to everyone at once that a merchant who accepts the seller's first asking price is not a merchant but a buyer out of necessity. Every counterparty, even the abyss, has something they need more than the stated price. One only needs to understand what a starving man needs, one who has been hoarding for 200 years and has only just begun to spend. He thought about this for 3 days, barely leaving the hall with the guild book. The answer came at night when, for the 100th time, he was flipping through the pages and paused at a line about buying out fighters' debts, after which the departures in response to the call ceased. The depth sang to the desperate. The depths took debtors for life. It did not feed on people. It fed on their consent. And that consent was born of hopelessness, like mold from dampness. Remove the dampness, and the mold has nothing to live on. The depths was no predator. The depths was a loan shark. It granted the desperate peace of mind at an interest rate that no one read, because the desperate don't read contracts. And what does a money lender need more than a one-time payment, even a huge one? Lance knew this from Gavarna, from Feru, from all the knowledge of the lower city. A moneylender needs a steady stream. Lance spent 3 days calculating with Morel and the treasurer. They consulted the continent's population censuses, the White Branch's mortality records, and the temple records. It turned out that more people died of natural causes in the world in a single year than the depths had gathered through its call over 2 centuries. On the 4th day, Lenz entered a trance and proposed what he called the Contract of Eternal Circulation, which Morel rewrote in fair copy 12 times, because a contract with the Abyss could not contain a single ambiguous phrase. The depths release all those taken, all the shelves along with the bodies, because an honest delivery tolerates no shortfall. In return, the exchange coin grants the depths something it has never had in 200 years of theft: an honest shop up above. Every person on the continent who dies a natural death in harmony and peace gains the right to voluntarily bequeath their consciousness to the depths, just as one bequeaths a house or a field, without coercion, without deception, with the right to change their mind until their last breath. The guild keeps a registry, teaches people that what lies below is not torment, but quiet shelves, establishes bequest chambers in every city, and takes upon itself the role of eternal mediator, just as a money changer mediates between 2 coins. Instead of the hundreds stolen over 200 years, the depths receive a voluntary, pure stream that grows forever along with the continent's population. A one-time plunder versus an eternal cycle. Any moneylender knows which to choose. The depths were silent for 3 heartbeats that lasted an hour. Lance hung in black nothingness, clinging to the image of the counter as if it were a handrail, and felt an ancient hunger, counting for the first time in 200 years. Huge scales swayed in the darkness. On one pan lay everything that had been accumulated. On the other lay the future, and the future weighed more. Then the Abyss answered, and the answer was the question Lance had both awaited and feared. Who guarantees a contract that lasts for eternity if the merchant is mortal? People lie. People die. Guilds fall apart. Who will keep their word in 100 years, in 1,000? And Lance gave the answer he had been preparing from the moment he learned the nature of his class, an answer he hadn't even told Morel beforehand. The class itself will be the guarantor. The shard of the depths living within him, his shop, his shelves, his coins of valor. After Lance's death, the gift will not pass to an heir, nor will it dissipate. It will return to the depth from whence it came on the day of his awakening and carry the contract with it into the very heart of the Abyss. The contract will not be a piece of paper held by people, but a part of the nature of the depths, like the riverbed is part of the river. His legacy, his one miracle for all those taken. The scales came to a halt in the darkness, and the depths said yes. Up above at the mouth of the well, 6 hours had passed. Olma checked his breathing 3 times. Morel had already put on her gear and was organizing the team for the descent when Lenz opened his eyes. He was gray with exhaustion, having aged by an hour, and he was smiling. He said that the deal was sealed and that the depths had demanded only one addition, in accordance with all the rules of trade. An initial payment toward the future flow. A single consciousness, given voluntarily, and now serving as a seal on the contract, because an agreement without the first coin is just talk. It grew very quiet. Dross stepped forward and said that he was an old widower and agreed. Garth pushed him aside with his shoulder and said that he was the old one here, and the captain hadn't even mastered his guard yet. Sarah silently began to take off her gloves, and both fell silent because no one argued with General Wolf. And then, from behind them, a voice rang out that they hadn't expected. The fleet surgeon had brought this man the day before from the field hospital at his own request. A veteran of Sarah's First Northern Army, he had been shattered by that very war 40 years ago. He was missing both legs. His lungs had been burned by deep penetrating gas. He'd been screaming in pain every night for a quarter of a century, so much so that his neighbors in the infirmary had begged to have him moved farther away. From his stretcher, he said that he'd heard the call every night for all those 40 years and had stayed only out of stubbornness, because for a standard bearer, it's a disgrace to leave to the enemy's song. And now they're offering him not to surrender, but to pay with his own life for 4,000 souls. And for the first time in 40 years, someone needs him entirely for himself, not out of pity. He asked for the honor of the first sacrifice, just as one asks for the honor of the first banner on the wall. Sarah turned at the sound of the voice, and Lance saw the commander of the North, whom the ministers feared, drop to her knees before the stretcher, right into the mud, and addressed the man lying there by name and rank. Standard-bearer Yorek, first of the North. She held his hand and asked if he was sure, and he laughed, coughing, and replied that the general always asked unnecessary questions before an attack. At dawn the next day, everyone who had been on the plain gathered at the mouth of the well. The corps lined up in ceremonial ranks. The guild stood with their banners. Yorek was lowered on a stretcher to the very edge, and he demanded that they raise him higher so he could see the formation. He joked that this was the first time he was going into battle while lying down, and that it was actually easier to aim that way. Then he fell silent. He looked at the brightening sky, at the formation, and at Sira. And he said he was ready and that the first Northern had completed its retreat. A glow rose from the well, soft and warm like the hearth in a family home.
Yorek stepped into it, smiling. But for the first time in 200 years, that smile was not a theft, but a payment in good faith. And the entire formation gave the departing warrior a military salute. And then the earth sighed, deeply, with the full might of the North, from the chasms, from the adits, from all the wells, from the ridge to the ash mines. Light rose, and in that light people emerged. Alive. In flesh that the depths had returned along with their consciousnesses, for an honest deal tolerates no shortfall, and the abyss now traded honestly. The first to emerge were the residents of Kosh, squinting and searching with their eyes for their homes. Behind them came the cooperative members from 20 years ago, not a day older, with pickaxes on their shoulders, asking what year it was now. Then came the soldiers in the tattered uniforms of the 1st Northern Division, lining up at the exit in columns as they remembered from long ago. Heron's deserters, lost one by one over the course of 2 centuries. Hundreds and hundreds of people in the world. At first, the plane was silent, unable to believe it. Then it howled, wept, and ran to meet them.
Sarah stood among the soldiers she had buried over the past 26 years. They recognized her, gray-haired and old, and reached out to her while she kept her face composed for exactly 4 seconds. Lenz turned away so as not to watch the general cry. And that is why he was the first to see what he had been searching for in the light that stung his eyes. A man in a miner's overalls with a pickaxe at his belt emerged from the well. He squinted into the sun. He looked at the council's chain on Lance's chest, at the guild banner above the well, at the crowd and the army. And he grumbled that he'd left his son for 3 years, and the boy had managed to stir up trouble across the entire continent. Lenz stepped forward, and for the first time since the Hall of Awakening, allowed himself to let his guard down. His father embraced him just as he used to after his first shift in the mine, firmly and in silence. After checking his palms, the Crown handed the campaign over to Sarah's triple command of officers and Lance, while Heron left under escort following the regimental council's mutiny. Over 7 days of trances, Lance uncovered the ledgers of the usurer of the depths, who accepted only voluntary offerings and, instead of the one-person-for-one-person exchange, sold her a contract of eternal circulation, voluntary pledges through the guild chambers forever, with a guarantee in the form of his class, which, after Lance's death, would return to the abyss carrying the contract. The volunteer standard-bearer Yorek became the seal. The depths restored to the flesh all those taken over 2 centuries, including Sarah's army, the village, and Lance's father. A year later, the city near the ash tunnels was unrecognizable. It was now called the Northern Scales, a name coined not by Lenz but by the market vendors, because caravans from 3 sides of the continent passed through the city, and everything under the sun was weighed and exchanged there. Strength for silver, silver for safety, the past for the future. Near the old spillway stood a building unlike any other in the world, the Chamber of the Quiet Shore. White stone, wide windows, a garden at the entrance. Inside, notaries from the Guild and the Sisters of the White Branch kept a registry of wills for the depths. And Olma, who had moved north for good, spoke personally with everyone who came for the first time. Over the course of the year, 11,000 people across the continent signed a voluntary will. Most were elderly, and Olma told Lenz that they arrived wary but left at peace, because death had ceased to be a plunge into darkness and had become a move to the quiet shore, from where, according to rumors, one could even hear the living. Two of her passed away naturally that year, surrounded by their families, and both left with a smile, while the wells glowed that night, warm and steady like oil lamps. The depth upheld the contract flawlessly, to the letter and to the image. The call fell silent across the entire North on that very first night and was never heard again, anywhere or at any time. The wells stood open, and warmth radiated from them, so that in winter the boys would run to warm themselves by the mouths of the wells until their mothers dragged them away by the ears, more out of habit than out of fear. Twice that year, the depth, of its own accord, returned those who had been bequeathed. Those had already considered themselves safe on the ledge. The first to return was the old miller, who remembered that he hadn't told his granddaughter where he'd buried his money chest. After that incident, Lenz fell into a trance and spent 4 hours negotiating an amendment granting the right of repurchase to any testator at any time. The depths bargained hard, demanding that the amendment double the duration of the Guild's mediation, and Lenz agreed, binding the Guild for eternity twice over. He emerged from that trance with a strand of gray hair at his temple at the age of 19, and Morel didn't speak to him for a week after learning the price he'd paid. Then, without a word, she sewed an inside pocket onto his doublet for Olma's heart drops. The Coin Exchange Guild numbered 3,000 masters across 40 cities, and the waiting list for admission was booked 2 years in advance. The charter that Lance had finalized that winter, spending his nights poring over the book, prohibited the sale of copies to entire armies or to states in bulk. Only to individuals, by name. With an entry in the register, backed by a guarantee, and with the Guild's right to revoke a copy from anyone who used its power against the defenseless. According to his words, recorded in the first line of the charter, this power must remain a craft and not an arsenal. Twice a year, the charter was tested for its strength. The Southern Principality offered the Guild treasurer a weight of gold for 1,000 copies for its army, and was refused. It then attempted to secretly bribe the branch master, but the master turned in the intermediary immediately because he remembered who had paid off his family's debts. The Council of Five became the Council of Six, and at the very first meeting of the new council, Lenz introduced a statute banning debt bondage across the entire continent, a ban on lifelong indentured servitude, an interest rate cap, the debtor's right to a hearing before the Guild Arbitration Court. The White Branch and the Bread Union supported it immediately. The Steel House followed suit after a speech by Gracchus, who testified to the effects of hopelessness on people. The Maritime League haggled and ultimately backed the bill in exchange for preferential treatment for northern ports. The Golden Table voted against it alone and lost. At their next meeting in the capital, Fair told Lenz without a smile that the boy had taken the best commodity in the history of the trade, despair, away from the banks. Lenz replied that he had left the banks the best of what remained, an honest interest rate from honest people, and that there would now be more honest people. Let him do the math. Fair thought for 3 seconds, and for the first time, extended his hand first. After the return of the Sarah army, the Ministry of War underwent what the newspapers called the Great Purge. The soldiers returning from the depths remembered everything. The orders by which they had been sent to the secret tiers, the papers by which they had been written off, the names beneath the resolutions. 6 months of tribunals ended with the dismissal of 1/3 of the staff. The court stripped Heron of his rank and nobility for the plain where he had been willing to watch a corps perish for the sake of requisitioning supplies. The word inappropriate by a separate royal decree was permanently banned from use in military resolutions,
and Sarah hung this decree in a frame in the office of the Northern District Commander, opposite the old banner of the 1st Northern Corps, which had been returned to her from the depths by the standard-bearer who had replaced Yorek. The House of Vales collapsed without a single blow from Lens, and in this lay my clean accounting for the year.
The returning mining cooperatives from 20 years ago filed lawsuits based on old resolutions from the Vale and Sons firm. For every closed mine, for every life written off. The courtrooms were packed. Lord Cedric sold the mines and the mansion to pay off his debts and moved to a rented house in the capital. The guild bought the mines at auction, fairly outbidding Farah, and immediately implemented his father's safety regulations, requiring double fastenings and banning single shifts. Dorian Vale was left without an A retinue and with no future for his family name. And Lance did something that no one but Morell understood. He sent Dorian a letter offering him a position as a junior instructor at the hunting school. By virtue of his status as an A-rank knight, and as the only person in the entire courtroom who had spoken the truth back then at the spillway. Dorian didn't reply for 3 days. On the 4th day, he arrived at the school before dawn in a plain doublet without a coat of arms, and silently began drilling the new recruits. 6 months later, his group maintained the school's best formation, and when asked by a reporter about his past, he replied that he was learning a trade from a merchant. After reading this, Garth grumbled all evening that Lance was gathering a bunch of good-for-nothings worse than Syrah and would soon open a separate guild for them. Lance replied that he'd learned the trade from the best, and Sarah, who was visiting that evening, raised her mug in his honor. Lance's father turned down every position offered to him 3 times, and on the 4th try, they left him alone. He returned to the mine as a shift foreman, saying that he'd been on the shelf for 3 years and had rested up enough for the rest of his life, and that his hands remembered the pickaxe better than a pen. On Sundays, he would come to the guild hall for dinner, scold his son for not getting enough sleep and eating on the go, and examine his palms, just as he had once examined the mine supports, meticulously and lovingly. Lens's mother cried every time she saw the framed receipt hanging above the hearth during that first month. It was that very first one for 600 silver torn in half in the square. Lens had glued it back together and hung it up himself despite her place, so that everyone who entered the Carver household would remember where a person's worth begins and where it ends if a person doesn't give up. Tobin became head of the guild's intelligence, keeping his eyes on 40 cities, and his gray lock of hair from the plains enjoyed such success with the capital's young ladies that he spoke of it more often and more colorfully than he should have, until Morell threatened to freeze his tongue. Drost took command of the guild guard, and his recruits stood guard at the quiet shore chamber as if it were a shrine. Grack the Hammer joined the guild a month after the council. He had donated his champion's chain to the Steelhouse Museum and now taught the newcomers a strike, saying that he was teaching them what he himself had been unable to defend against, and that a true fighter must know the price of his strength. Otherwise, he is not a fighter, but a menace. And in the fall, Lens led Morell to the well by the hall, not on registry business. At the very spot where a year ago people had stepped out of the light, he spoke to her at length and incoherently, beginning with why the guild's balance sheet, and Morell listened to the helplessness of a man who had been dredging up the abyss for 3 minutes, then took pity on him and said yes before he even got to the point. He had forged the ring himself from the first coin of valor that the system had converted into metal for him through a special transaction, and the depths didn't charge a penny for it, writing in their reply an image that Ulma translated as a gift to the house of the mediator. The whole city celebrated the wedding for 3 days. Garth cried and assured everyone it was because of the ale. At night, pillars of quiet, warm light rose above all the wells of the north, from the mountain range to the tunnels, and remained there until morning. The elders crossed themselves and said that the abyss was singing, but for the first time in 200 years, it was not calling but offering congratulations. In the spring, the last letter arrived from the she-wolf. Sarah wrote briefly, as if giving an order. Beyond the Western Sea, the envoys speak of their own depths and their own calls. The Crown asks the Council of Six whether Master Carver is ready to teach others the language in which one speaks to the abyss, because the North has mastered it, and the world is only just beginning to hear its own wells. At the bottom, instead of a signature, a she-wolf was drawn, smiling as much as she-wolves are capable of smiling. Lenz read the letter on the threshold of the shop, not the one in the corner of his vision, the real one. A year ago, he'd opened a shop in Northern Scales, with a door, a counter, and a bell, where anyone could order a copy, sign up for a raid, leave a will, or simply ask the master for advice, because Lance followed one personal rule: 1 hour a day behind the counter in person, no matter what was going on in the Council of Six. His father had whacked together the counter for him himself, out of planks from that first overturned cart of Garth's, having haggled for the planks from an old hunter in exchange for 2 mugs, and grumbling that his son, a member of the council, couldn't even afford to buy a decent cart. Lance finished reading the letter, stacked it with the rest, and looked out at the square. The morning was proceeding as usual. A caravan was being loaded bound for the south. Near the Quiet Shore Hall, a nurse was taking 2 elderly testators out for a walk. Academy students were running to class, and among them, a boy in a gray cloak was lugging a street vendor's box on his back, lagging behind everyone else. Lenz called out to him across the square and asked what grade he'd received on his awakening test. The boy stopped, puffed out his chest as usual, expecting ridicule, and replied defiantly that he was an F-rank accountant without a single combat skills, and that he was used to people laughing at him without having to wait in line. Lenz smiled and said there was no need to wait in line. He opened the shop door for the boy, the bell jingled, and Lenz spoke the words that by fall would be carved in stone above the entrances to all 40 branches of the guild. In this world, there are no useless classes. There are only unread descriptions. The boy stepped inside warily, and his eyes began to widen at the sight of the shelves. Lenz stood in the doorway for another moment, gazing northward, where open wells breathed with warm light beyond the ridge. Somewhere down there, at the very depths among the silent shelves, lay his contract, one destined to outlive him, to become the law of the abyss and keep that light burning when neither he nor the guild nor that stone above the door remained. The continent's lowest-class merchant thought the deal had been fair by all accounts. He had given his inheritance and his only miracle to the depths. The depths gave the people back their dead, their sleep without a call, and their peace. And everything that lay between those 2 lines of the ledger, he earned himself. By the hook, by the ledger, by the price he paid in advance, and by the rule he had established even above the first goblin pit, a rule the entire North now knew by heart. It is not the one to whom power is given who wins. The one who knows its price is the one who wins. Lance entered the shop and closed the door behind him. The bell jingled and fell silent. Work awaited him behind the counter. The Chamber of the Quiet Shore maintains 11,000 wills, with the negotiated right of repurchase. The call has fallen silent forever. Death has become a move. The Vale House fell due to lawsuits filed by those who had returned. Dorian became an instructor. The word inappropriate was struck from the ministry's charter and prohibited by decree. The guild, with charters in 40 cities, where power is a craft, not an arsenal, enacted a ban on debt bondage. The father returned to the mine. A patched-up receipt hangs above the hearth. Lance married Myrrell, with a ring made from the first coin of valor.